Afternoon. Let me welcome everybody. Thank you for choosing to spend this beautiful afternoon here with us to discuss what we think is a very important and timely topic. Let me begin. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't at least take a moment to acknowledge the tragedy in Brussels. Washington is such an international city, so interconnected. Maybe it affected some of you even more directly than the rest of us, but certainly from my institute, we offer condolences and thoughts and prayers in the aftermath of this awful tragedy. Today we're going to spend some time talking about China, the U.S. China relationship, and our policy. 10 years ago, believe it or not, then Deputy Secretary of State Bob Zoellick gave a speech which subsequently became known as the Responsible Stakeholder speech. And for people in the China watching community, China policy community, this really was an inflection point of sorts. It was an explicit acknowledgement that China's rise had reached a particular juncture where it was in a position to be more active in regional and global affairs, to be consequential in policy. And really the speech, I think, was an acknowledgement of that, but also a suggestion that our policy had to adapt to that. And after a decade plus of positive engagement, we needed to not only continue the engagement, but raise our expectations and challenge China to be a so-called responsible stakeholder. So 10 years later, we want to have this conversation today, which will, in effect, judge how we're doing, take a look at China's response to that challenge, and in various sectors, whether they have met the challenge, met our expectations, where they may be falling short. And we want to discuss if we're arriving at another potential inflection point, if there's something we need to do differently with respect to our approach to China, if we're not getting the outcomes that we want and they're not reaching the expectations that we set for them. So I think we have a good program today. We're going to start with my good friend Evan Feigenbaum, who I'll introduce more thoroughly in a moment. And then we'll move on to a panel of experts who will address different sectors, both internal to China as well as regional and global issues. And then we'll close with a conversation with two experts on China and the global commons, and really try to be more forward-looking and press them on policy alternatives. So with that, we will kick off with an opening speech by my friend Evan Feigenbaum. Evan currently serves as Vice President of the Paulson Institute. He previously worked in the private sector with the Eurasia Group. He and I worked together in government. He was at the Department of State, served as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of South Asia and Central Asian Affairs. He also served in the Office of Strategy, Policy, and Planning. Evan also is an accomplished scholar, received his PhD from Stanford University, his BA from Michigan University, where he studied with one of the real legends in the China field, Mike Oxenberg. So Evan is, as we say, a gentleman and a scholar, but he's also had his impact on policy. Evan was in the Office of Policy Planning at the time this speech I mentioned was delivered. I think he had a role in developing the concepts, if not the speech itself, and certainly had a role in the follow-on implementation of that policy. So what we've asked Evan to do is to set the scene for the rest of our discussion today by giving us maybe a little historical background of the speech and the policy, and his experience at Department of State and beyond in terms of the early efforts to implement that policy. So if you would please join me in welcoming Evan Feigenbaum.
Great, well, thank you. As Randy said, we are old partners in crime. We go back to the mid-1990s when Randy was in the Defense Department, and I was a budding academic at Stanford writing a dissertation on defense industry in China. So it's a pleasure to do this with Randy. It's also a pleasure to do this with Project 2049. We've done some things before. Go back a long way with Mark Stokes, who I just saw in back, and we've done some reports together on Central Asia and other things as well. So thanks for having me. Randy asked me to be reflective and then also look forward, to look backwards 10 years to the period around 2005 when Bob gave this speech, but then also to kind of bring the story up to now and think a little bit about what some of the concepts that were embedded in that speech might mean or not mean for the challenge we're facing with China today. So I thought, since I don't have a lot of time, that I would do this in 3 bites. First, I want to kind of rewind the tape, not just to 2005, but to the decade of the 2000s, because I would argue that that was a pretty important inflection point, both for China's role in the world, but also how the United States approached China as the issues and challenges that confronted us and the Chinese began to change a little bit. Second, having rewound the tape, I want to then fast forward the tape. And I want to talk a little bit about why, if you think about some of the things that are at the core of that concept in the speech, coordination between the United States and China turns out to be pretty hard on a lot of things. And I would argue it's going to continue to be hard pretty far into the future. And I'm going to reflect a little bit on why I think that's the case. I have a few theories of my own. And then third, since Asian architecture in particular is in the program, I just want to say a little something at the end, because it's a subject I talk and write a lot about. So I want to bring it back to the Asian story. Now first, to rewind the tape to 2005, and I was in the policy planning staff of the State Department, but working very closely with Bob at the time, who was Deputy Secretary and had a very strong interest in China. It is, in a sense, we were talking about this before, kind of remarkable that we're still talking about this speech 10 years later. Having been around Washington a long time, there aren't that many speeches that you talk about 10 days later, 10 months later, much less 10 years later. And the fact that we are, I think, reflects the fact that there were concepts embedded in there that help us think a little bit about the challenge that the rise of China and of Chinese power generally confronts the rest of us with for the international system. China's a different kind of challenge, really, than anything that I think we've faced in a long time in international history. And so there's a need for concepts and a search for concepts to think about what we're wrestling with. Now, remember that, if you go back to the 1960s and 1970s, you rewind the tape even further, China was really a very different kind of power than it was today. It was really a revolutionary power in a lot of ways, talking about class struggle and proletarian solidarity, supporting revolution from Bolivia to North Borneo, and essentially opposing many of the major international institutions that have prevailed in the liberal order and in the international system in the post-war period since 1945. Now, if you begin to fast forward the tape from the 1960s, by the time you get into the 1990s and into the decade of the 2000s, China, of course, has joined many of those institutions that it once opposed. So the nature of its interaction with the prevailing order is a little bit different. And that, I think, begins to set a little bit of the context for the period in 2004, 2005, 2006, around the time of this speech. When I look back at that period, there are a few things that I think resonate with me, both about the notion of a responsible stakeholder as Bob used it in his statement, but also the ways in which China's interaction with international institutions and the international order was changing at the time. So let me just tick off a few of those. First, as I said, this was a moment where I think the predominant issues of the previous 20, 25 years began to give way to a somewhat different set of issues. The previous 25 years basically had largely been about China and the structure of the international order. And at this point, there was an inflection, I think, that transitioned from structure really to the choices China made and China's behavior within those institutions. And the reason for that is because China, frankly, had joined these. Rhetoric, in a lot of ways, around 2005 was still 5 to 7 years behind the reality of China's role in the international system. I remember being in the State Department, and Randy, you were there, you were Rich Armitage's chief of staff, and a lot of the rhetoric around China policy was still about working to integrate China into the international system. But structurally, China was in. China was in the WTO. China was a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. China was a signatory to protocols on everything from ozone depletion to chemical weapons. You pick your functional area. China had signed. So structurally, China was in, and that meant that the issue was less structure than behavior and choices, as China now had its seat at the table. And so the choices for China were really about how to articulate its interests now that it was inside rather than outside the tent. And I think for the United States, it was increasingly not just how to integrate China, but how to push this more integrated China to act in ways that were consistent with our interests and our values. Now, by the time you get to 2005, this is a particular inflection point because I think the last really great integration project of the previous decade had been completed, which was China's accession to the WTO, which was the negotiations completed in the period around 2000. China acceded in 2001. So with China now inside the WTO and structurally in most of these institutions, I think this kind of pivot point from structure to choice, from structure to behavior, was a kind of timely and interesting way to think about China's role in the world and what the challenges were for the United States as it interacted with China. Now, second thing was really, I think, the change from China as a regional player to much more of a global player. There was a global turn in foreign policy in China. Now, I don't want to over-determine or over-argue this. This is not to say that China hadn't had a global role previously. But I think the period kind of in the decade of the 2000s were, as I said, a bit of an inflection point for China in this respect. If you want to see this in action, let's just pick out a region. And I picked, say, Central Asia, because it's a region I know well, because as Randy said, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the region for a few years. So if you think about the period from 2000, when President Bush was elected, to 2008, when President Obama was elected, and you look at something like direction of trade between Central Asia and, say, Russia on the one hand and China on the other hand, there's almost a wholesale reversal as the lines of trade and percentages of trade for the region basically cross. I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I'm just going to ballpark them. Around 2000, China constituted about 3.9% of Central Asia's external trade. And Russia, by contrast, was 25, 26%. By 2008, 8 years later, when President Bush left office, China's had basically quadrupled to about 17 or 18%, and Russia's had shrank by a quarter over the same period. And those lines have continued to cross since then. In fact, if you look at the dollar figures, it's even more dramatic. China's trade in 2000 with Central Asia was, I think, lower than $2 billion gross. It was about $1.8, $1.9 billion. And by 2008 or 2009, it had grown 17 or 18 times in excess of $30 billion. And again, that's continued. And here I'm just talking about the direction of trade. Now, if you throw in infrastructure construction, project finance, a whole array of other metrics and indicators, China's role in regions that are on its periphery, but even beyond its periphery, changed appreciably during this decade. So I think this turn from kind of thinking about China only in the Asian context to thinking about China in a much more global context was, in my view, prescient and timely and has become even more relevant, as you all know, since then. Now, when people talk about Bob's speech in 2005, they tend to think just about the speech, and they forget about, as Randy, you called it the implementation, they forget about the follow-on architecture that came after it, which included an agreement between the United States and China to create an architecture of what were called sub-dialogues, focused on different regions of the world. There was one on Central Asia, there was one on South Asia, there was one on Africa. If I'm not mistaken, there may have been one on Latin America too. And ironically, after Bob left the department, I became Deputy Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia. And so I ended up conducting one of these dialogues that we had helped to create when he was Deputy Secretary. So, you know, that architecture of a much more global interaction, an attempt to think about interests, where they converged, where they did not converge, I think, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, actually looks quite ahead of its time if you think back to the period of 2005, and then you take a look at where we are today. Third, the issue of public goods provision and providing public goods, which really in a lot of ways is at the core of the speech. If you look at the section of the speech on energy, for example, where Bob talked a little bit about mercantilist policies versus reliance on the market, the notion of, quote unquote, locking up energy supplies around the world. This notion of essentially fungibility of commodities, the notion of economic public goods generally, was in many ways at the core of the speech. And not to be flip about it, but if you think about the term responsible stakeholder and then you try to think about its opposite, to me the opposite of a responsible stakeholder is an irresponsible free rider. And the United States, by the middle of the decade of the 2000s, had every reason to encourage China to be the former and not to be the latter, not essentially to take a free ride off the public goods that others were providing, particularly as China's capacity and China's wealth were beginning to increase. Now, this kind of is interesting to think about in retrospect, because when I read the way people have written about this speech over the last decade or so, most of the critiques of the speech or the concept really have come from people who are, I would argue, most skeptical of U.S. China coordination on an array of issues. But ironically, that was not the case at the time. I don't know if any of you were in the room at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations dinner in New York in September 2005. You may have been. I see Bob Suttinger in the audience. I don't know if you were there. But actually, it was quite the opposite. The people that were most critical of the speech were actually those who were most enthusiastic about U.S. China engagement, many of whom I remember actually turning green in the room, because the basis of the emphasis on public goods was that China needed to assume a burden of responsibility rather than simply be a free rider on the existing system. And that notion of putting a burden on China, expecting China to step up in ways that it hitherto had not, was, I think, it was seen as somewhat edgy by a number of people at the time who had been enthused about a different model of U.S.-China cooperation. I would also add that the concept was not meant to be static, and I don't want to speak for Bob, but I would say that if he were here, he'd probably say that it was not meant to be static. At the same time, it was meant to be dynamic. The international order would adapt, but it was nonetheless a conservative speech. And if that sounds contradictory on its face, to me, it's not. The speech was a recognition that as rising powers, particularly in terms of their economic weight, came to play a greater role in the world and had greater capacity, they inevitably would seek to change the system. And because of that recognition, this speech and this concept were, in a sense, a conservative defense of the existing order by encouraging China to, as Zoellick put it, support, sustain, and adapt the international system that had enabled China's success. So China, rather than seeking to replace the system wholesale, should recognize the benefits that it derived. It was, in that sense, a conservative defense. The last point I want to make on rewinding the tape is I think one reason that this concept resonated in the mid-2000s was because it coincided with a particular debate in China itself and among Chinese about China's role in the world. This was a period where you may remember there was a debate about concepts like peaceful rise or peaceful development associated with people like Zheng Bijian, who'd written an article in Foreign Affairs calling for China to rise peacefully. So the debate about peaceful development, peaceful rise, and the debate about responsible stakeholder, in some sense, coincided and crossed over with each other at the same period of time. So the concept, as Bob articulated in New York, actually, I think, sparked an interesting debate inside of China itself. And one thing that might be interesting to reflect on in the panel is where we are 10 years later in terms of those debates about China's role in the world inside China. You don't hear a lot about peaceful rise and peaceful development in China anymore. Instead, when you hear people talking about concepts, they talk more about things like new type of great power relations. So if you think about those, we've transitioned from an emphasis on the system and concepts that are systemic, peaceful development, peaceful rise within the system, to things like new type of great power relationship, which is really much more about bargains among and between powers. It's a less systemic and much more, I think, bilateral concept. Very, very different, and with very different implications, I think, for the United States and U.S. interaction with China. Okay, so hopefully I put a few things on the table to discuss. Now, just to fast forward a little bit to now. How does China exercise its stake in the international system today? And frankly, why? I don't think I'm telling you anything when I say it's hard for the U.S. and China to coordinate, harder than it should be on a lot of issues, even where the United States and China share interests. Why is that the case? Let me throw out a few ideas, and you can tell me what you think of these. First, I would argue that there's really just no scenario under which China could be a purely status quo power, full stop. Because even if China accepted the international order precisely as it is today, it would still want to reweight institutions, voting stakes, change governance mechanisms to give itself a greater voice, a greater role, and greater influence on outcomes and decisions. So in that very structural sense, there's nothing particularly status quo about China, even if it accepts the institutions as they are. Now, China's not alone in that. In fact, it's joined by several other emerging and rising powers around the world. I've spent part of my career working on India, for example. A democracy deeply ambivalent about the rise of Chinese power in many, many ways, but which nonetheless has joined China in creating an architecture of some new institutions around the world. The BRICS Contingency Fund, the BRICS Development Bank, calling for changes to the structure of the United Nations Security Council, reweighting of chairs and shares in the IMF, the World Bank, and Bretton Woods and multilateral development institutions. India has joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which I want to come back to at the end in a second. So all of this is a long way of saying that even accepting institutions and architecture as it is, there would still be an element of non-status quo-ness to China's interaction with them, and that's important. Now, as a practical matter, that poses a challenge for the United States, because to make changes that are designed to reflect the realities of 2016 rather than 1945, 1946, or 1966, pick your date in the past, we'll have to make some changes that inevitably are going to rub some people the wrong way. If you want to make this real, I'll give you an example. At the end of the Bush administration in 2008, I was working very closely with Dan Sullivan, who's now a fairly newly minted Republican senator from Alaska, but was then Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs, on a kind of updated U.S. approach to global energy policy. This is something Dan, being from Alaska, was extremely interested in. The International Energy Agency, which was kind of the prevailing agency for consumers, it's not exactly a consumer analog to OPEC because it doesn't function as a consumer cartel, but it was was supposed to be the main institution for major energy consumers. Did not include China and did not include India, the two fastest growing energy consumers in the world. You might ask yourself rhetorically, what kind of international energy consumer organization does not include the fastest growing energy consumers in the world? And so there was some interest among Dan and others, and Secretary of State Rice and others, in trying to think about how to update the architecture to match it to current functional realities in terms of international energy consumption. Now, one problem was that IEA membership was linked to OECD membership in the IEA Charter. But another problem, frankly, was that to bring these new major consumers, China, India, others in, you would have to reweight the voting shares, essentially at the expense of Europe. And if I'm not mistaken, it's been a while since I've looked at this, but I think voting weights in the IEA, at least at that point, were linked to something like 1973 or 1974 energy consumption, making countries like Belgium and the Netherlands essentially energy superpowers, which they really had no business being given their size and their consumption profile. So inevitably, even an institutionally status quo China is not necessarily a behaviorally and procedurally status quo China. Now, a second point, and I think another reason that it's going to be challenging, is that China's enthusiasm for big institutions as a source of legitimacy and emphasis on form contrasts with a much more functional American approach to things. Americans, we tend to just be a very functional people. And so, if I think about the decade of the 2000s, take something like the Global Nonproliferation Architecture, where the United States was actually an enthusiast for informal, ad hoc institutions and initiatives like the Proliferation Security Initiative that were outside the existing informal structures, but nonetheless were designed to match form to functional problems. China has a somewhat different view of that, and I think that's going to continue to be a challenge. Since time is running short, I'll just make a couple more points. Third, there's just the fundamental collision in Asia between economics and security, and this has been a big theme of a lot of my writing and speaking over the last few years. In fact, in a lot of ways, I think this is the central strategic dynamic in Asia today. The collision between economics and security, which no longer run in parallel lines, so you can tell the story of Asia almost as a tale of two Asias, economic integration and then security fragmentation, often among the same countries and same partners. Now, this dynamic matters for the United States, but it also matters for the U.S. China relationship, because I think in many ways China has accepted prevailing international economic arrangements. They're very enthusiastic, for example, about WTO dispute settlement, partly because they win. They've beaten the United States, they've beaten the European Union. But if you look in the security area, and particularly in Asia, it's very clear that the United States and China have some clashing security concepts, not least on the South China Sea, but on other things too. And I won't dwell on that because I know you're going to do that on the panel. But I'm happy to talk about that if you'd like. A last point, I just think, and this is just from practical experience, and I think Randy and Bob and others in the audience who've been in government would agree with me. There's a challenge, I think, turning common interests into complementary policies. Just having common interests is not the end of the story, it's the beginning of the story. And in fact, for the United States and China, who do have some common interests around the world and in Asia and on security and on economics, the problem has been that to turn common interests into complementary policy, you have to overcome a series of other problems that have proved to be very difficult. Things like making sure that you have shared threat assessments about the scope and urgency of the threat that you face, dealing with countervailing interests that obstruct cooperation, even on issues where you share interests. I'll give you an example to make that real. Afghanistan. When I was Deputy Assistant Secretary for State for Central Asia, we had a base in Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia that was there principally to be a mobility and logistics platform to fight the war. And the United States and China certainly share an interest in a stable Afghan state that does not harbor or export terror. But if the route from point A to shared objective at point P means you have to get through B, C, D, E, F, G, that includes things like a NATO military presence on China's western periphery, NATO operations, U.S. military operations, potentially more long-term access arrangements, that introduces a set of countervailing interests that make things harder. Likewise, North Korea. The United States and China, absolutely. Do they share an interest in denuclearization and stability? Sure. But the fact is, China values stability more than denuclearization, and the United States values denuclearization more than stability. And so from my standpoint, that means that the United States is much more risk tolerant when it comes to denuclearization steps and measures that might risk stability in the North Pacific. That leads really to the last point I want to make, was about Asian architecture. I do think that this is bigger than just a China story. And part of the challenge the United States has is that Asia is changing in very important, dynamic, and fundamental ways. And the region that it's going to confront us in 2025 will look very different from the region in 2015, much less 2005. And it will be difficult to rewind the clock back to 1985, given what's happened, particularly in the economic space in this region. And the three issues I'd flag for you: one, as I said, the collision between economics and security. In the security realm, the United States has exercised leadership in Asia because it has been a provider of both security-related public goods and economic-related public goods in this part of the world. And in the security space, until China and Japan have a Franco-German moment, which is not on the horizon, the United States is, and as far as the eye can see, will continue to be an important provider of security-related public goods for this region. Through alliances, forward-deployed military presence, there are challenges making the right kinds of investments in our posture, in forces, in weapons and technologies, adapting to change. But in the economic sphere, there is no scenario under which the United States continues to play a role analogous to the one that it did in the 1960s or the 1970s. In trade, for instance, U.S. trade with every country in Asia is increasing in absolute terms, but declining in relative terms. And the United States' role as a source of final demand on which export-led economies could essentially power their way to growth, a lot is going to change, because Asian economies increasingly provide economic public goods to one another. And at a time when the tools of economic statecraft are under attack from both left and right in the United States, not just TPP, but the whole mix of tools, that's a challenge that the United States faces because, and this gets to my last point, the story of change in Asia is not just a China story. When you talk about architecture in the panel, I hope we recognize that the story of Asian architecture did not start in Beijing. It didn't spring from the head necessarily of Xi Jinping. China is trying to leverage many of these trends to its strategic and economic advantage. But in the 1990s, after all, it was Japanese bureaucrats, not Chinese, who came up with the idea of Asian Monetary Fund that didn't include the United States. Asia-only trade agreements, bond funds, swap agreements. This incipient Asian regionalism that the United States in the 1990s chose to squash would be much harder to do today under prevailing circumstances. So some Asian institutions that do not include the United States will advance, I would argue, regardless of American views and preferences. And what's more, Asia is becoming integrated, East, Central, and South, in ways that are going to change the map of the region. It will be more Asian than Asia Pacific, more continental than subcontinental, as East and South Asia become more strategically and economically intertwined. And its continental West, more Central Asian than Eurasian, as these former Soviet countries discover their Asian roots and become linked not just by Chinese capital, but Japanese capital, Korean capital, and so on. And the United States needs to think hard and strategically about how to position itself to maximum strategic and economic advantage in that new Asia. And this is something I've written and talked a lot about, and we can talk about it if there's time for Q&A. But why don't I stop there, and I hope that gave you some things to chew on. Thanks.
We're very grateful for that, Evan. That was a fantastic way to kick things off. If you'll allow us to do something that is inelegant, maybe since we're running behind, we can begin to set up chairs and Evan can take a few questions. So hopefully that's not too disruptive. It'll allow us to go seamlessly into the next panel. But Evan, if you're willing.
Sure.
Yes, sir. I think we have a microphone as well.
Bill Jones, Executive Intelligence Review. China is, of course, embarked, as you know, on this Belt and Road project, which is really changing the history for the whole region. And every time that President Xi comes here, he invites the United States to be a part of it, and nobody really says anything about it. In fact, for about a year, I think, people ignored it. Nowadays, you're getting conferences and the like on it. But it would seem to me that this would be a branching point, that if we took up that invitation, that would be a point of cooperation with China, which today is really lacking, and obviously something that's very important for them, which of course I think would enhance the value of the U.S. cooperation. Why aren't we doing something about it, and wouldn't this be a direction we could take to try and create some kind of a greater rapport on major issues that extend far beyond the U.S.-China relationship?
Sure. I'd say three quick things in response. One, I don't know what it means to be invited to join the Belt and Road, because the Belt and Road is a Chinese bilateral initiative, unlike a lot of other connectivity projects like the AIIB, for instance, which is multilateral. It's a development bank. This is largely a bilateral initiative funded by Chinese development banks and new funds. So the idea of a U.S. role in Asian connectivity, sometimes maybe working with China, makes sense, but the Belt and Road itself is largely a bilateral initiative. So it isn't as if you get an invitation to join the Belt and Road. It's also largely focused on contiguous countries in Asia at this point in time. So the question for the United States, which transitions to my second point, is what role do we want to play in Asian connectivity? And that was what I was trying to get at the end of my remarks. I think intellectually, strategically, bureaucratically, the United States is really not well set up for the new Asia that I was describing. Intellectually, we still have three separate foreign policies for Asia. We have one for East Asia that's largely focused on strategic balancing in China. We have one for South Asia that I think is still much too focused on the India-Pakistan dynamic. And Central Asia, that's Russia. It's been hard for the United States even to think about that in an integrated way with an Asia policy. Intellectually, it's a challenge. Bureaucratically, Central Asia, for example, is with East Asia at the Defense Department. It's with Russia at the National Security Council. It's with India at the State Department. The Pacific Command in Hawaii has half of Asia, including India. The Central Command in Tampa has Pakistan and Central. It's just divided. So we're not well set up. And I'm not talking about a gigantic reorganization of the U.S. government, which we all know is impractical. I'm just talking about a more coordinated execution of strategy across these artificial dividing lines that reflect an old map rather than a new map. That gets to my third point. Yes, that could mean working with China. For instance, I think the way the U.S. approached the IAB, frankly, was kind of petulant and childish, and had no chance of success. And therefore, I'm not a big enthusiast of policies that have no chance of success, where you kind of go to the mat over things you're not going to succeed on. However, the U.S. needs to think about connectivity organically and in a bigger way. It's not just about China. And that was the core point of what I was trying to make, that connectivity is the product of the actions and choices of many, many Asian countries. There's a demand-side pull, but there are also many sources of trade and capital. In India, for instance, the bulk of the infrastructure is being funded with Japanese capital, not with Chinese capital. The Delhi Metro, the Mumbai-Delhi Industrial Corridor, high-speed rail for Indian Railways, all Japanese capital and a Japanese project finance. So sometimes with China, sometimes with Korea, sometimes with a different configuration of states, the United States, which really doesn't do publicly backed project finance in the way that China and Japan does through JBIC, needs to think about how it works, particularly by leveraging public-private partnerships, to work in creative ways. Because otherwise, as I said, this can be a very different region. So I like your thought, which is that we need to take connectivity more seriously, but I think we need to think about connectivity as bigger than the Belt and Road. It's not just a Chinese invention.
We have a second quick one we can close with. Yes, sir. Microphone right.
Thank you. My name is Mitsuo Nakai, member of Reagan Foundation. I came in late, so I missed a lot of talk. I'm sorry, but I have two questions. Number one.
We're running a little
Okay.
bit behind.
Okay. Can you comment on the unification of Korean Peninsula?
It hasn't happened, it doesn't look imminent, and it gets to a core thing I said, frankly, about security, which is, if I want to think about a new security architecture for Asia, people talk about security architecture, I always find that debate a little bit tiresome, because until China and Japan have a reconciliation that is analogous to France and Germany, which is nowhere near on the horizon, until the big questions like Korean unification and so on are resolved, it is hard to imagine a basis for collective or cooperative security in the Pacific. So I just say what I often say, there is no basis for collective security in the Pacific today. I'll repeat that, there's no basis for collective security in the Pacific today. And for that reason, most countries in the region will continue to look to the United States to be an important provider of security-related public goods in the region. So for the US, the choices we face include updating our posture, adapting our forces, technology investments to adapt to some of the new weapons and other challenges we face from China, from North Korea, from others. But ultimately, I think the principal challenges in terms of the way the region is changing, as I said when I talked about two Asias, are in the economic sphere. Because there I see the US falling way behind. There was a line people were using a few years ago that said, we're back in Asia. If you take what I said on its face, the United States is, as far as the eye can see, will continue to play a very critical role in security. But in the economic area, we will be challenged in new ways. I can make a case to you that we're further out than we were 5, 6 years ago. And I think that's the challenge of economic statecraft the US has to adapt to. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Really well done. Excellent. Thank you. Invite my colleague Rachel Burton from Project 2049, who will moderate the panel, and may I invite the panelists to please come forward.
Actually, they'll do it for us. Sit in the end over there. Sure. And then, do you mind singing for that one? Sorry. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the second panel, our first panel, really. I'm going to make my introduction really brief because I know we're running late on time. So again, my name is Rachel. I'm a research associate with the Project 2049 Institute, and I'm excited and honored to be here with a great panel for you guys to better understand the role of China as a responsible stakeholder moving forward. So I'm going to keep the bios really brief. You have them in the program, so I'm going to ask Dr. John Lee to kick us off. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to Project 2049. I think when you go around DC, there's lots of events, but when you look at the program, I think there are very few events that sort of get to the heart of questions in such a direct, honest way that this program does, so I'm delighted to be part of it. I've just been asked to give some very brief comments about the extent to which the nature of the government in China, the authoritarian government in China, and also the nature of the sense of national victimhood that has been perpetuated in China relates to the People's Republic of China challenging key aspects of this liberal order, particularly in Asia. And let me just begin with this whole idea of this rules-based order. You know, we use this term a lot, rules-based order. We defend the idea of a rules-based order, but we don't actually really spend much time thinking about what a rules-based order actually is. So what does a rules-based order look like, particularly in my region, in East Asia? Now, we know it's characterized by rules-based competition, that is, to compete within a defined set of parameters or defined set of rules. Countries and other entities agree on dispute resolution processes to solve disagreements. It's characterized by open economic and trading systems. You adhere to international law and the processes of international law. Now, all these factors, that's, this is all well and good to say that, but think about what a liberal-based order actually needs to function and to succeed, and I think that's actually a harder question. And I think if you think about it, no rules-based liberal order can exist if you don't have a significant separation between political objectives, economic objectives or agencies, legal, the way the law works, and administrative entities and agents. So what I'm trying to say is that governments genuinely committed to a liberal rules-based order use the tools of the state to uphold the rules of the game, most notably when it comes in a domestic context, protecting the rights for the citizen and putting the government, or in China's case, the party, under a particular set of rules that cover the whole country. Now, remember that when it comes to governments, when you think about so-called characteristics of whether it's states or individuals or entities that behave according to a rules-based order, you need compromise, you need negotiation, you need transparency in decision-making, you need habits of these that must be entrenched in your everyday practice, in your processes. And it's just a fact that authoritarian governments, particularly in China, do not do these things particularly well. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can't conflate economic interests with political interests, with strategic interests. So in economic activity, if you are truly devoted to a liberal rules-based order, you as a government or as a regime have to give up your capacity to intervene in legitimate economic competition between firms. You can't engineer outcomes. You can't use state power to engineer outcomes. You can't predetermine who the winners and losers are of a legitimate economic competition. But as you probably all know, China's authoritarian political economic system doesn't really work that way. Now, the CCP's failings when it comes to protecting its own constitutional rights of its own citizens are well known. Now, when it comes to economics, it's state-dominated political economy, that's just a convenient term that I'll use. If you look at the way it's designed, I know there's lots of economic activity. You can't just throw a blanket over what's happening in China or the nature of its economic system, but you can basically say that its state-dominated political economy is deliberately designed in such a way that the CCP retains a very interventionist and decisive role in predetermining a lot of economic outcomes through support, for example, and protection for its state-owned enterprises, even at the expense of domestic private Chinese firms. So I think the Chinese Communist Party has the same attitude when it comes to external policy. Conflating economic, political and foreign policy goals should be the exception in a liberal rules-based order. But if you look in America's case, the 7th Fleet that patrols the Indo-Pacific, the 7th Fleet cannot work with ExxonMobil to predetermine an outcome. Now, if you look in the Chinese system, the PLA Navy often does work with the CNNO which is the China National Offshore Oil Company, to predetermine some sort of outcome in the region. And if you want to take it to extremes, I think we saw it in 2014 when the Chinese state-owned company worked with the PLA Navy to put oil rigs in waters that were contested with Vietnam. Now, the Chinese Communist Party takes what I'd call a very old-fashioned Leninist view of power. There might have been a lot of changes in China since 1979, but in a sense, it still views power in a very Leninist way. And what I mean by that is everything, including multinational firms, professional groups, professional societies, whatever it may be, everything is viewed as a potential tool for the extension of party power, or at least the preservation of party power. There is no clear separation of economic, legal, judicial, and administrative agency from politics, or in particular from the capacity of the party to remain in power. So even the PLA, a professional army, it's actually the army that swears loyalty and allegiance to the party, not to the state. As far as the CCP is concerned, the interest of the party is the same thing as the interest of the state. The interest of the party defines the interest of the state, and there is no Chinese state independent of the party. Now, bringing it back to the question I'm trying to answer, consider all this in the context of this enterprise to coax or seduce China into becoming a responsible stakeholder within a rules-based order, and particularly a rules-based order led by the United States. Now, the responsible stakeholder framework assumes that we can collectively, through carrots and sticks, shape the PRC's ultimate objectives and goals. But I think to do that, you would require a very different kind of government in China to be in power. So all we can do really is shape the means by which the PRC will go about pursuing its interests, but I don't think with the current nature of the government we can shape the PRC's ultimate objectives or strategy. So remember that remaining in power in China is the party's #1 goal, that is above everything else, above economic growth, military power, whatever the case may be. #1 goal is to remain in power. And the PRC won't do anything that means it must loosen its grip on the levers of power whilst it takes the so-called Leninist view of power and power preservation. I think we should also be sceptical of arguments that just because China has benefited from the system, it will necessarily defend its system. Evan went through this argument a little bit, so I won't spend too long on it. But essentially, China benefits enormously, as we know, from the American naval role in East Asia. But while the US devotes ships and manpower and other resources to these efforts, China's basically a free rider. I mean, I just don't think there's any other way of viewing how the Chinese view the current strategic order, at least, in East Asia. Now, while China sees little alternative to rising and competing within this system, at the same time, from the point of view of Beijing, why not dismantle or change aspects of the system that you don't like to make it more conducive to its authoritarian setup? So this essentially is what the Chinese are doing. They're not challenging the system from outside, they're free riding and challenging it from within when the opportunity arises. Now, so China doesn't sign up to binding agreements with other countries. Note its stance on the code of conduct with the ASEAN, Southeast Asian countries. Now, it's part of the WTO, but it tends to game the open trading system, in my view, through preferential policies to its SOEs that in quantity terms go way beyond what any other country is doing. It doesn't respect smaller and weaker states as an equal bargaining power. Some of you might know, as the then Chinese foreign minister said to a room of Southeast Asian foreign ministers when there was a disagreement about China's activities in the South China Sea, quote, "China is a big country, others are small countries, that's just a fact." Now, in a liberal order, you use power to enforce the rules. In China's authoritarian order, you use power to entrench the position of the party and the party's objectives. Rules are seen as useful things that often facilitate transactions, necessary transactions, but you ignore them when your power is threatened. That's how they actually view rules. So let me now finally get to the issue of history and victimhood. Now, look, China's not alone. Every country has myths and some historical accurate stories of victimhood, but I think there are two differences with the notion of Chinese victimhood that are critical. First, the Chinese Communist Party has inextricably linked the idea of victimhood and avenging what they call 150 years of humiliation at the hands of foreign powers with the legitimacy of the party. Not many parties or countries actually do that. So they put forward the idea that the people in China must support the party because the party's destiny is to return China to a position of greatness. And the second aspect is that the party has essentially hand-picked moments from the previous Qing and Ming dynasties. They've cherry-picked moments where the Qing and Ming dynasties reached a certain apex, and they put forward these historical moments, which are very brief and very transient, as a natural, enduring, permanent state by which Asia must be returned to, and that is the Chinese position, the natural Chinese position in Asia. So you go back to Mao Zedong. What was the first thing, or what was one of the first foreign policy things he did when he seized power completely in 1949? A couple of years later, he invaded Tibet and then Xinjiang. What was he trying to do? He was trying to regain what he saw as the glorious peak of the previous Qing dynasty. Now, when you look at President Xi, China Dream or China Rejuvenation idea, what is it about? It's partly going back to mythical times during the last two dynasties when China supposedly ruled over the East and South China Seas. And I emphasize the word mythical. Now, the One Belt, One Road idea draws together myths, it draws together histories, with some it's factually based, but many myths about Chinese dominance over Eurasia and maritime East Asia. So it doesn't matter what is actually historical truth or what is based on some made-up myth. What matters is that the Chinese Communist Party and many Chinese elites believe it. In a sense, that is what is consequential. So Chinese elites and many in the Chinese Communist Party believe this version of history to be just, and they believe it to be true, and that the party's standing is linked to achieving these aspects. Now, Chinese aims in the East and South China Seas might have been originally being driven by strategic considerations of breaking out of the so-called First Island chain to negate American naval advantages, but they built a history and a myth around it, and the history and myth, in a sense, has now overtaken the strategic rationale. So even if there was some sort of strategic solution, the desire to achieve these so-called historical aims, I think will persist. Finally, the strategic and territorial order that we see in East Asia today, look, the fact is it's largely a creation of the post-World War II world. I mean, that's just a historical fact. Now, China wants to go back to moments before World War II. It wants to go back to moments of its own choosing to say that that should be the permanent state. Now, by the definition of what order is formed over many decades, but this particular order in East Asia is largely formed at a period in time post-1945. Go back before post-1945 to create something, and the very definition you will be subverting or challenging, particularly that strategic and maritime order, and I think that's what we're seeing with China today. Now, a lot of what I said is maybe somewhat abstract. I know I only had 10 minutes, but maybe in the discussion I can sort of dig down more into details if you'd like me to. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So I think today I just saw a news article in Xinhua that talked about how China actually wants to start helping Asian and African countries build parliamentary capacity procedures. I'm curious to see how they're going to do that with an authoritarian political system. So we'll see what happens moving forward. Our next presenter is going to be He Qinglian, and she's a senior researcher at the Human Rights in China. And so, Dr. He.
I'm Qinglian He. 我今天演讲的题目是中国局势与亚洲稳定的关系，讲4个问题。
My name is Qinglian He, and today I'm going to talk about the Chinese situation as well as its relationship with Asia in terms of stability. And I'm going to talk about 4 points.
第一个问题呢，就是讲中国威胁论的实质在变。
The first thing I want to talk about is the China threat theory is actually continuing to evolve.
从上世纪90年代，美国生态学者布兰提出“谁来养活中国”以来，到现在中国对中国的看法已经经历过一个180度的大转弯。
As you know, back in 1990s, there's a well-known U.S. Ecological economist, Mr. Brown. He proposed a theory or a question: who is going to provide for China? And since then, as you know, the international society's view on China has a 100-degree change.
到了这个2005年，美国的外交季刊发布了一个中国和平崛起，这篇文章是中国的一个学者叫做郑必坚写的。那么以后中国看自身 和这个外国看中国，就沿着两条平行线一直走到今天。
In 2005, in the foreign affairs, one of the period or the September issue, one of the issue of foreign affairs, an author named Zheng Bijian talked about China's peacefully rising. And since then, the way China look at itself and the way the international society look at China have been continue to be parallel.
国外看中国，就是从中国崛起到中国衰落。
So from a foreign perspective, when the outside world look at China, they talk about the rising of China and the decaying of China.
中国本身呢，就是从向外面输出这个中国模式，用北京共识取代华盛顿共识，到今天忙于应付内部危机。
So in terms of Chinese model, first they try to export the Chinese model, and eventually they use the Beijing consensus to replace a Washington consensus.
那么这两种看法到底符不符合中国的现实？我认为中国政府比谁都更清楚。
But whether these two perspectives actually fit the real situation in China, who knows? I think that the truth is Chinese government is the one who knows the best.
因为中国政府很清楚，目前中国已经进入处理内部危机阶段，
Because Chinese government is well aware that right now they have to start dealing with the internal crisis.
我要讲的第二个问题就是中国的经济危机不是一个简单的危机，它是一个企业破产、银行的坏账危机，再加上失业潮，三者叠加在一起。
And my second point is talk about the economic crisis in China. Actually, it's quite a complicated issue because not only a lot of business have gone bankrupt, a lot of banks have non-performing loans. At the same time, they have to deal with the unemployment in China.
2001年中国加入 WTO 以后，一度成为世界工厂。
In 2001, when China joined WTO, it has once became the world's factory.
那么从这个2009年开始，这个世界工厂进入衰落，很多资本都已经撤到东南亚地区，或者企业破产了。
But starting from 2009, this world factory start to decay, and a lot of capital has flown to Southeast Asia, and therefore a lot of business go bankrupt.
从前年开始，中国的国有企业进入破产潮。
So starting from 2 years ago, the state-owned enterprise started to go bankrupt one by one.
中国政府呢，不断地用银行的贷款在扶植这些企业，导致银行的坏账已经达到了占银行总资产的8.1%。
Chinese government tried to use the bank loan to try to support those failing business. Therefore, the non-performing loan eventually take up 8% of the total assets of the bank.
中国银行坏账的规模有多大呢？有12万亿美元，占整个中国 GDP 的10%还要多一点。
So just exactly how big of a scale is this non-performing loan? Actually, it's about 12 trillion US dollars, which is about 10% of GDP.
目前中国的破产，中国企业破产已经引起了严重的失业问题，中国的失业人数高达3亿。
Because a lot of business have gone bankrupt, therefore it caused a lot of problem in terms of unemployment. Currently, the unemployed population in China is 300 million.
3亿在中国是个什么概念呢？就是占劳动力年龄人口9.6亿的1/3。
So what does 300 million means? Actually, right now, the people who are in the employment age, the number of people in the employment age is 900 million. So that take about 1/3 of those people.
这意味着中国政府从1989年以后和中国人民订立的面包契约已经破产。
That also means the bread contract the Chinese government have made with its people has gone bankrupt.
那么中国政府做好了应付危机的准备没有？ 接下来我要谈这问题。
So my next question is whether the Chinese government have made preparation to respond to all these crises.
应该说中国政府已经开始做准备，从习近平上任以来就在着手准备。
I should say Chinese government has started preparing, and to be more specific, starting from the time when Xi came into power, he has started to make the preparation.
政治上他做了3件事，一件事反腐，
He did 3 things politically. The first one is anti-corruption.
第2件事他是扶贫，就是扩大那个低保面，就是让和这个广大底层呢达成某种和解。
The second thing he did is to alleviate the poverty. What he did in a way is come to some kind of settlement with the people on the bottom of the society.
第3点呢，就和在座的各位有些人的工作有关，就是打击这个外国资助的 NGO。
And the third thing might have something to do with some of you here. Basically, he started to crack down on the NGO that's supported by the foreign enterprise or entities.
本世纪以来，美国和欧盟等国家在中国总共资助了1700多家环保、医疗、扶贫，还有少数政治团体。Thank you.
So starting from this century, EU and United States have supported about 1,700 NGOs in China. Most of them are involved with environmental protection, medical or healthcare, poverty alleviation, and very few of them, or some of them, are involved with the politics.
那么这些 NGO 凡属带有政治色彩、权力色彩的，目前200多个都已经停止活动了。
And out of those NGOs, any of them that have anything to do with politics or gaining power have been terminated, and there are over 200 of them.
共产党造成了这样一种局面，就是共产党如果自己要是遇到困难，中国将没有一个合适的组织来接替它。
So CCP is trying to come up with this scenario, meaning when if China ever run into problems, there's no other organization that have enough power to take over.
第4个问题，我就想讲一下国际社会应该如何应对这个中国今后衰败的局面。
And the fourth question I want to talk about is how international societies going to respond to China's decaying.
奥巴马总统在4月号的《大西洋月刊》发表了一个谈话，其中涉及到中国的时候，他说：“一个衰败的中国比崛起的中国更可怕。”
When interviewed by The Atlantic recently, U.S. President Obama pointed out that a decaying China is actually scarier than a rising China.
他的担心根据在哪里呢？他说，如果中国的经济发展不足以支撑这么多人口的话，那么中国就会用民族主义的口号组织起来向外扩张，引起南海地区的不安。
Where does this worry come from? Obama say if China fails, if it is not able to maintain a trajectory that satisfies its population and has to resort to nationalism as an organizing principle, then it's going to try to expand outwards and cause a lot of problems in South China Sea.
我觉得他这个担心呢是有道理的。
I think this worry actually makes sense.
因为这个从2011年阿拉伯之春变成后来的阿拉伯之冬，最后出了一个伊斯兰国，再造成叙利亚难民潮淹没欧洲。我们看到了有些地区的革命不一定带来新秩序。
As we see from the Arab Spring that took place in 2011, that it eventually turned into Arab winter, and that as a result, now we have ISIL and also have the Syrian refugees that flooded Europe. We see that with the revolution doesn't always bring us good solution.
所以我们在考虑中国问题的时候，一方面我们要认识到共产党确实是一个非常邪恶的专制政权。
So when we try to understand China, on one hand, we have to realize that Communist Party indeed is an evil dictator.
但是一方面我们要认识到，就是那个秩序的破坏容易，秩序的建立很困难。
However, we also have to realize that it's easy to destroy order. However, it's hard to rebuild an order.
我个人呢，从来没认为中国会强大到超过美国，但是也没有认为呢中共政权马上会崩溃。
I myself never thought that China would actually surpass U.S. or overtake U.S. But at the same time, I also do not think that Chinese political power is going to collapse.
支撑中国生存的有四根支柱，第一根是生态环境。
The thing to maintain the stability in China are 4 pillars. The first one is ecosystem.
这一根支柱大家知道，中国现在是水陆空全面污染。
But in terms of this, you probably all know that China has a lot of pollution in the air and in the water.
人们的饮水已经不再安全，雾霾非常严重。
There's a lot of smog, and also the drinking water is not safe for the people.
第二个呢是一个社会的伦理道德。
The second is the social morality.
那么中国正好呢是这个伦理道德的核心是信用，那么中国正好是在4个层面上这个信用都不好，而且破产。
However, the core of this morality is the credibility, and there are 4 different levels of credibility, and unfortunately, they are all bankrupt right now.
国家信用是指国与国的信用，世界上很多国家不相信中国。
The first one is national credibility. That means the trust between the countries, and you know a lot of countries in this world right now do not trust China.
政治信用是指政府和人民之间的信用，现在中国的人民也不再相信政府。
The political credibility is the trust between the government and its people, and a lot of people in China nowadays do not trust the government.
还有就是商业信用，我们都知道中国企业在外面的商业信用不好，销售假冒伪劣等产品啊。
And the third one is commercial credibility. As you know, some of the Chinese business do not have very good reputation overseas. They tend to sell counterfeited goods or inferior goods.
还有一个就个人信用，现在中国的人和人之间也是互相不信任的啊。
The fourth credibility is the personal credibility, the trust between people, among people. And nowadays, people in China do not trust each other.
第3根支柱呢，就是指这个生存状态，那么就是要一个社会要给人民提供就业。中国现在有3亿多失业人口。
If we go back to the third pillar, which is the commercial credibility, then you have to talk about the basic survival. As you know, China right now have 30 million of unemployment.
现在就剩下唯一维系中国社会的，就是中国政府这个强权统治。
So the only pillar that's still supporting China's stability is the dictatorship of the Chinese government.
由于没有任何有组织的力量接替中共，那么中共的崩溃就意味着中国的崩溃。
Since there's no other force that can replace the Communist Party, so if the political power were to collapse, then it means China will collapse as well.
我建议各位在座的大家呢，以后多想一想，在中国呢民主化以后，怎么样恢复秩序、建立新秩序，多想想这方面，不要再弄出一个第2个叙利亚。
So my advice to all of you is to think hard how, after China become a democratic country, how it's going to be able to reconstruct the order so that we will not have another Syria.
谢谢大家。
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we've read a lot of articles in journals these days of people talking about the decay or the potential failure of the People's Republic of China, and I think it's refreshing to hear it from a Chinese perspective. So thank you so much for your presentation. And moving forward, we have Dr. Molly Roberts, and she's the Assistant Professor of Political Science at UC San Diego, and she's going to talk a little bit about censorship and propaganda. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I realize I'm the only person with slides, but I'm a data person, so I just wanted to show you some data. I was asked to come here to talk about how censorship and propaganda might influence the U.S. China relationship and China's relationship with other countries in the future and might be influencing it now. And I think this is actually an empirical question, and there are two really main empirical questions we have to think about. So the first is, well, what does China censor, and what is its propaganda strategy? These things aren't necessarily clear off the top of your head. You might not know that automatically. And the second is, how does this influence people's opinions, and how will this influence China's actions in foreign policy? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you just like a very short empirical study of one part of censorship in China, and then I'm going to speculate and talk about where we need more empirical work to really understand what its influence will be in the future. Okay, so I'm going to show you this, and I'm going to come over down here so I can see it. What does China censor? So I did a very short empirical study, 2 empirical studies, on post-deletion in China. So what does China take down off the web? And basically, post-deletion in China is pretty huge. It's implemented manually, so there are lots and lots of censors in China that take down posts off of the internet. And by hundreds of thousands of workers who are at social media firms in China, so they are directed by the government to take down certain types of posts, and also within the government, what we call the internet police, who sort of direct this and make sure that this all goes right. And so before we sort of studied this empirically, we didn't really know what was taken down on the whole off the internet in China. And there were sort of 2 theories of what was taken down. One was critical comments about the state, and the other was information about collective action or protest events. And so we studied this, and I'll talk about the studies in just a second. And what we found was that really the target of censorship in China is not criticism of the state. Really, the target of censorship is stopping collective action. And why might this be? Well, the benefit of stopping criticism of the state isn't really clear, but there's a huge cost. So that's one thing I want to emphasize, is that censorship in China is very, very costly. If you take down critical remarks about the state off of the web, then you don't know about what might be threatening you. You don't know what people think. And actually knowing what people think is really useful to governing. And so there's a huge cost of stopping criticism. But stopping information about collective action and stopping the spread of collective action is actually quite beneficial to the state. This is probably the biggest threat to the Chinese government right now, are protests and collective action events. And the cost of stopping that and stopping that information from spreading isn't very big, because you already know the grievances of the people protesting. So what we did is we stumbled across this study rather accidentally. We were working with doing automated text analysis of blog posts in China, and we realized that we would go back to URLs and that they would be missing. So we had the post of censored blog posts, and we had the posts of uncensored blog posts, and we could compare these two and figure out what was being censored. So we could sort of reverse engineer censorship. So what we did is we collected about over 3 million different social media posts before they were censored. And for each of these posts, we downloaded the content the instant it appeared online, and we revisited it later to determine whether it was censored. And then we used computer-assisted methods of text analysis, so these are like machine learning methods, to try to figure out, well, what is being censored in China? And what we found was that basically events that were associated with collective action, pornography, and criticism of censorship was being censored in China. So, and that actually that there was a whole bunch of discussion online in China about policy, about news events that were extremely critical, that were just being left alone and were completely not being censored. And so here are some examples of things that were highly censored in China. There were the protest in Inner Mongolia that happened in 2011, was a very highly censored event. Also, there were the protests in Zhengcheng that were very, very highly censored, protests about lead-acid battery poisoning in Jiangsu. These were very, very highly censored events, along with pornography and things that had to do with criticism of censorship itself. But then very controversial issues like education reform for migrant children or increase in power prices, which had a lot of criticism of the government, was being left online, and there was open discussion about these. So here's an example of what we call a censorship timeline. So here's from January to July of 2011. And you see there's a lot of, this is about Zhengcheng, and there were these huge riots in the city in Zhengcheng where a pregnant migrant worker got beaten by the police. And you'll see that there's then all of a sudden a lot of talk about this city, and then also a lot of censorship. So this red here is the number of posts taken down. So within an event, within a collective action event, there's a lot of censorship in order to prevent the spread of information about that collective action event. So we followed up on this study actually with an experiment. So we realized that we might be wrong with our observational study because what happens is that sometimes when you post something on the Chinese web, it's automatically held for review without actually being published. So it could be that they were censoring criticism and we weren't actually collecting that data. So this is what happens when you submit a post online in China, is either it's published immediately on a Chinese website, or it could be held for review based on something within it, and then it wouldn't appear online unless it was reviewed and allowed to appear, or it could be deleted and never see the light of day. And what we realized is that our observational study, we only collected the posts that saw the light of day at some point, that were posted at some point, and we didn't see these posts that were held for review automatically. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't wrong, and we did an experiment to follow up on this. So for our experiment, we did, for each round of our experiment, we took the 100 different top social media posts, media sites in China. We created 2 accounts on each of these different social media sites. Then we wrote 1,200 unique social media posts that were randomly assigned to be about a collective action event or not about a collective action event, and pro-government or anti-government. Okay, so this is a 2x2. We randomly assigned social media posts that we wrote to be about a collective action event and supportive of the government, or about a collective action event and against the government. And we posted these online. And we checked for censorship afterwards, and what we found was that if it was about a collective action event, it was much, much more likely to be censored than if it was not about a collective event during that time period. So if it was about a protest event or an activist who could generate large gatherings of people, basically those are much, much higher censorship rates than if it were not. And interestingly, that within each of these different topic areas that we posted in, there was no difference between support and criticism of the state. So there was no difference in censorship between support and criticism of the state. Within each of these different events, if you were supportive of the state, you were equally as likely to be censored than if you were critical of the state. So what does this mean for international relations and what we think about how China will interact with the world? So I was thinking about this a little bit, and I think, some of my current research applies to this a lot, and I think we need more empirical research to really understand this in detail. So what this study sort of focuses on is post-deletion, and what we see is that post-deletion is focused on China's biggest threat, which is really collective action protests its own people, right? And in some sense, this has some relationship to foreign policy, because when we see nationalist protests in China, information about nationalist protests is also censored. This is something that's threatening to the Chinese government. It's threatening to have people out on the streets. But in order to complete this, we have another type of censorship that can really affect, I think, U.S. China relations, and we need more empirical work to really understand this. So in order for post-deletion to work, you have to have control over the social media sites, right? And so one of China's censorship practices is it blocks foreign websites from Chinese IP addresses through what we call the Great Firewall, right? And essentially what this is doing right now in China is dividing U.S. and Chinese news sources, and so that Chinese citizens read very, very different news than US citizens do. So when I go to China, all of the sites that I use to get news, including the New York Times, including Google News, including Facebook or Twitter, right, are all blocked. I have to use a VPN to access them, right? And so what this means is that Chinese citizens are reading completely different news than US citizens. And this might be something that we could be concerned about in the future, depending on if two populations have a completely different perspectives on international relations. The second thing that I think we need to focus more empirical research on is propaganda. So even though censorship does not seem to be focused on foreign policy issues, there's a lot of propaganda that is focused on foreign policy issues. And some of the research I'm doing right now is trying to figure out or identify moments when every single Chinese newspaper prints the same article, which is an indication of a coordinated news article. And some of these are focused on international relations issues, like Japan, like Taiwan. And these are things that we might be concerned about if it is really effective at persuading people who read the newspaper about these issues, then we might be concerned that this is again separating what people think about foreign policy in China from what people think about foreign policy in the US. And this is not just unique to newspapers. There's also a lot of online propaganda in China that we could be concerned about. So China infamously has this group of people, what are called, nicknamed the 50 Cent Party, who are supposedly posts online propaganda about China at the direction of the government. And what we've realized, we've learned a lot about this over the past few years because there have been some leaks of online propaganda and online propaganda posts. And what we found after reading these, and I've read a lot of them, is that they're very nationalistic. They're very sort of pro-China. And this could again be something, especially with this divide between Chinese and U.S. news media, this could again be something that could have implications in the long run for U.S.-China relations. So just to leave you with that, I think we need to do more research on what it means for two countries to have completely different news media and have completely different sources of news, and how this might influence perceptions of what is the right foreign policy in the future.
Thanks. Well done. I think as you're going through your presentation about censorship and propaganda, it reminded me of what He Qinglan was talking about when there's the sort of what's the alternative to the CCP and sort of what happens perhaps after the fall of the CCP or something. And it reminds me of the generations in China. So each generation to me I feel like has a flashpoint. You have the Cultural Revolution flashpoint, you have post-Tiananmen flashpoint, and I wonder the next generation, like, is the flashpoint going to be information sharing? Or the fact that more and more are being aware that there is this censorship, that there is political messaging coming to them, coming to the people, citizens in China. So I wonder if that's going to be the next sort of flashpoint for the upcoming Chinese generation. And moving forward, I was originally going to have Dr. Chung present, but I know Dr. Master has a class to teach later this evening. So Dr. Chung, if you don't mind, if Oriana Master, if you'd like to go next.
My name is Xianong Chen.
Oh, my class is until 5 if he wants to go.
Oh,
Fine.
Doesn't matter if you
Okay. Thank you. I just put on my timer. I do have a class. I teach a class at Georgetown on the Chinese military. And this evening, my students are giving technical intel briefings on Chinese military platforms. And when their time is up, I play a big buzzer and they have to sit down. So in the fairness of not supporting hegemonic policies, I'm going to hold myself to the same standard. I have a timer right here, and I promise I won't go over. Today I was asked to talk about the tactics that China uses to undermine the security architecture, in particular in the South China Sea. I myself am a China security and military specialist. That's mostly what I focus on. As Evan said in his speech, looking at security issues have become quite tiresome. In the past couple of years, we've seen the relationship, at least in the security realm, between the United States and China deteriorate. If I look back at 2009, when this period of increased Chinese assertiveness began, China was really focused on targeting, in particular, the United States. China engaged in many dangerous and risky actions in the South China Sea in order to show the United States that continued military operations, and in particular, surveillance and reconnaissance in those areas, were becoming more and more dangerous. The Chinese hope at that time was that by showing the United States that there were risks associated with those types of operations, the United States would self-opt out of their continued military presence in the Asia-Pacific. And this now seems like a crazy idea, but if I can just, if you'll indulge me, I think at the time, the Chinese came close to being successful. There were debates occurring in 2009, 2010 within the United States government in which there was questions about whether or not certain types of military activities led to such benefits that it was necessary for us to maintain them. And there was a healthy conversation about the necessity to accommodate certain preferences of the Chinese and what types of preferences were reasonable and what was not reasonable. The United States at that time, I think, did include some policies that signaled their resolve to continue operating, such as the rebalancing. And since then, China hasn't changed its objectives, but just changed its tactics. And now China is much more focused on harassing regional actors, mostly weaker actors, to basically signal the same idea, which is that China hopes that other countries, as it rises, will accommodate its preferences. And this is a controversial point, I think, among many US audiences, but it's not controversial in China, which is China would be better off and would be happier if the United States militarily disengaged from the region. Now, I know all the arguments against that position. You can tell me about, and I was just on a panel last week in which a gentleman told me, but in the 1970s, when Nixon had his policy towards China, Kissinger said to the Chinese, do you really want us to leave the region because of Japanese remilitarization? And of course, the Chinese thought it over again and said, no, of course, it's better to have the United States here to keep Japan down. We've heard arguments of the benefits of the US Navy maintaining the SLOCs and China free riding. But at this point, for the Chinese, at least when I read their strategic writings, especially military writings, there's very little benefit to being surrounded. And again, the Chinese don't use the term containment, they use encirclement. Being encircled by the military of another country to which you're not sure of their intentions. We're not sure what China is going to be like when it rises. Chinese write about how they're not sure how the United States is going to act during its decline. So there's different views on this, but in China, it's not controversial to say that the Chinese are hoping that they could be the preeminent power in the Asia Pacific. So we can talk a bit more about that in the Q&A, but for me, that is the starting point. So what does that mean about responsible stakeholder? I think the Chinese discussion about the responsible stakeholder concept very clearly mirrors this type of understanding of achieving the preeminence that China hopes to achieve in the region. Now, I have a number of statistics, and we can talk about what China is actually doing in the South China Sea. What are they building on the islands? And more importantly, what have they just built in the past year? One of the interesting things about teaching a course on the Chinese military is that even though I teach it every semester at Georgetown due to its popularity, I have to rewrite my lectures every single semester. Most of my professor colleagues said to me when I first started, don't worry, you prepare all your teaching in your first year, and then you don't have to think about it ever again, and you focus on publications and gain tenure. Meanwhile, just this January, the Chinese military decided to throw away its whole organization structure to enhance its mobility and its ability to project power. And so all my slides and org charts about how the Chinese military has operated since before 1949 became obsolete. So in the past year even, what has happened on these South China Sea islands is amazing. They now have airstrips on some of them. They have loading piers, satellite communications antennas, harbors, radar towers, and the list goes on. The important thing to note is something that Director of National Intelligence James Clapper wrote in a letter to Senator McCain just earlier this month, which is the bottom line is, quote, China has established the necessary infrastructure to project military capabilities in the South China Sea beyond that which is required for point defense of its outposts. Chinese power projection capabilities has increased. So I think while it was said earlier that China obviously is going to try to revise the system, I think there is an implicit understanding in the concept, or there has been in the United States, that China hopefully would be integrated into a system that was then consistent with US interests and US values. I don't think that this is a feasible goal. I think Chinese see their interests in many ways as contradictory to those of the United States, and their definition of a responsible great power highlights this point. So the Chinese translation of responsible great power, instead of responsible stakeholder, is actually responsible great power, They don't focus on that stakeholder concept, they focus on the great power concept. They explicitly affirm the power status of China in the international system, and they try to convey through this discussion of the responsible stakeholder a sense of their own leadership and their own expansion of leadership in global affairs. For them, the responsible stakeholder concept is considered too limiting because the Chinese are hoping to employ the concept, I believe, to expand their actual power. If you look at, for example, what they're trying to do in the region, they will make numbers of arguments in which they're appropriating this idea of responsible great power. they use it in their rhetoric, in which they say that they are contributing to the international order. And they'll name a number of things to show that they're contributing. The most popular, of course, is the UN peacekeepers and the fact that China is the #1 contributor to peacekeeping missions. They also point out, for them, responsibility is about outcome, not about process. So in the Chinese mindset, they are more responsible than the United States. And one thing that concerns me as we focus so much on the South China Sea is a current debate that's occurring about China's role in Northeast Asia. This debate suggests that China can protect peace and security and stability in Northeast Asia. And it's the U.S. role, which is inspiring aggression in Japan, and that's creating insecurity and therefore instability in the Korean Peninsula, that leads to insecurity. And so China is using this rhetoric not only internally, but also in the relations with other countries to say, you would be better off if the United States were not here. Sure, the United States has their values and their systems and their processes, but in the end, what is the result? The result is heightened insecurity. And if China were in charge, they could resolve the North Korea crisis. If China were in charge, Japan would be kept down and wouldn't threaten the countries of the region again. And if China were in charge, we wouldn't have these concerns about clashes between great power military such as that of the United States and China. So a speech by Li Keqiang highlights some of these ideas in which he says that China is the defender of world peace. China contributes even more so than any other country because they contribute so much to world economic growth. He argues that China is a defender of the current economic and political order and wants to, however, reform that system. He lays out, and in many Chinese strategic writings, they lay out all these ways China plays a constructive and international role. In the South China Sea, just this week, there were a number of stories about new institutions that China is building, like a tsunami alert center, in which China was quick to point out that they have, quote, already begun issuing tsunami alerts to the international community. They talk about the public goods they provide, such as operations at sea. And they say their land reclamation work is largely intended to bolster civilian research, search and rescue, and maritime security. Now, I know this seems like just a lot of rhetoric. I myself, from my military background, know that when anyone talks about search and rescue operations, that's always like the easiest type of operations. When we try to cooperate with other countries, it's basically like throw someone in the water, throw them a raft, and then we say we cooperated with each other. It's kind of like the low-hanging fruit of military operations. But I think it would be a mistake to just look at this as rhetoric. I think the Chinese are trying to rethink how they can increase their own influence in the region and also globally. China is trying to engage and trying to shape the narrative and trying to shape, as what's previously been stated, what the rules-based order means. And so in 2009, when we had the first incident with China at sea, the impeccable incident, I myself went out to work on this issue at PACOM. And I remember that I came to the conclusion that even though this was only one incident, it was the first data point in what turned out to be 7 years long coercive diplomatic campaign for China to promote and strengthen its territorial claims. In my mind, at the recent plenum, when China defined responsible stakeholder, in our language, responsible great power for them, for the first time, it is a shift in Chinese thinking. They're more open to engaging globally, and when that time comes and the Chinese are more involved in Afghanistan, they're more involved all over the world, I think at that time the United States will regret the day that we asked for more active participation, because it is very difficult to coordinate interests. Even when you have the same interests, China has different preferred tactics, different prioritization of those interests. But perhaps more simply, what we've seen with their behavior in the South China Sea is they might be a rising power. They might soon be even a great power, but they surely are not a mature power. And so if you have an unprofessional military and even foreign policy experts getting their hands dirty in some of these extremely complex issues around the globe, I think that's going to complicate things for the United States. So to conclude, because my time is up, it's always asked, what does the United States do about this? And the bottom line is, on the military side, the only thing I see imposing caution on the Chinese is their own lack of confidence in their ability to operate. we need to start thinking about, in the language of military operations, deterrence by denial, not by punishment. Telling the Chinese it'll be costly for them to take certain actions is not as effective as telling them they're going to do a bad job if they try. So I think that's the way that our policy has to go, and that the United States has to think more about principles and less about alliances. And so what I mean by that is our alliances are extremely important, but we can't only protect principles when they involve our allies. Because what that makes the United States look like is what the Chinese call us, which is a hypocrite, right? Either you care about freedom of navigation, and that applies to everybody, and you're willing to protect that right, no matter if it's Vietnam or if it's the Philippines, or what you're there to do is to protect your allies. And I think we'd have a much better job in shaping the cost-benefit analysis in Beijing if we focused on principles and within the alliance structure. So with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you. I think your buzzer didn't go off, so assuming you did a good job, A+. I know it's hard not to come to a conference about China and not talk about the South China Sea. I feel like it consumes our daily Twitter feeds every day. But I think one thing that's important to talk about, and I think Evan touched on it, and even other speakers on this panel have touched up on it, is that there is a lack of trust in the Asia Pacific, and I think one thing that we need to hold on to is that I think the United States brings a lot of trust and security to the Asia Pacific, and sort of how authorities in Beijing will try to usurp that trust will be one to look at moving forward. And lastly, we have Dr. Cheng Xiaonong, and he is the director of the Center for Modern China in Princeton and has extensive experience working in Beijing. So, Dr. Cheng, if you could take it away.
I'm a specialist in a comparative study of transition in former and the remaining communist countries. So today, we'll start from the end. That is, today we talked a lot about the behavior of the Chinese government in the near future. And I'll give my conclusion at the beginning that my point is Chinese government will be unable to do a lot of things in the next decade. And because its political and economic situation do not allow the Chinese Communist government to do much more in the future. And then I'll bring the question back to the background. Actually, when we talk about Chinese government behavior, we have three commonly concerned questions. Number one, China started its economic reform 40 years ago. Now, why doesn't the Chinese government embrace democracy? Number two, we just talk about China's rise. And a couple of years now, we're talking its fall. Why rise and fall? And what will be the next? And number three, when we talk about weak economy in China in the near future, what will be its political leadership perform? Would it be a stronger leadership or weaker leadership? And what kind of threat the new leadership is going to bring to neighboring countries and to the United States? So back to the first question about the transition. We, many years, have believed that transition countries from socialism will finally eventually embrace democracy and reach to the democratic institutions. But not many people are talking about who were making the transition. And actually, in my study in comparative transition between Russia and China, I found that there are three capitalism making or three transitions in the economic sphere. And with different transition patterns, we have different political consequences. Actually, the three different patterns were made by three different social groups. Number one is the so-called making capitalism without capitalists. that occurred in Central Europe, Poland, Czech, Hungary. And number two, the second pattern is, I call it comrade capitalism. That's made by former red communist elite. That's the case in Russia. And China is the worst case. It's the third pattern. I call it a communist capitalism. That is, capitalism is made by current communist red elite. They are different. In Russia and in other European countries, the red elite, after they experience democratization, they embrace capitalism. They were not afraid of democracy. But in China, the red capitalists, they embrace capitalism but hate democracy because the process of privatization is different with that in other former communist countries. In my study, I found that eventually privatization in China was made by red communist elite through asset stripping. In other words, through corruption or stealing. Overnight, Chinese red elite became millionaire, even billionaire, and that's under the cover of the Chinese communist regime. Therefore, for them, they are capitalists, but they are red capitalists and communist capitalists. They are still Communist Party members. They hate democracy not because it's American version, because it's an umbrella that covers their safety. If after democratization, in the circumstance of rule of law, those communist elite would worry very much about their safety because by rule of law, all their previously activities in asset stripping were criminal. They could be sent to court. They could be sentenced to death. So they know that after democracy, they have no future, will have to lose lives. Therefore, in China, when capitalism is made by red capitalists, there is no possibility for that regime if we imagine that one day they're going to embrace democracy. That regime will not. That elite group will not. That's the current situation in China. So we should not expect that transition from market to democracy will go on. Actually, it stops. It's over. And then the second question is about the economic situation. Why, after boom, there is a long-term recession? In terms of this problem, I have to provide some basic economic analysis about China's market. We all know that China has huge population, and many believe that the Chinese market is huge enough to absorb products from all over the world. But actually, it's not the case. It even cannot absorb the products produced by Chinese labor. I analyzed the data from China and the data from the World Bank and make a comparison, and I found that, unfortunately, after 40 years, the ratio of household consumption in GDP in China now is still 36%. What does that mean? The lowest level in the world. In other words, from the beginning of the reform, this ratio went down rather than went up. In other words, then you go back to the elite privatization, you understand that reform, that transition, that privatization benefited not its people, but its elite only. And those elite expended money not in China, but in Paris, in New York, the Fifth Avenue, and somewhere else. Then without huge consumption support, the Chinese economic boom is not self-sustainable. So without such kind of consumption capacity, how Chinese government maintained its economic growth? It used two ways, and you can find the answer from the 101 economics textbook. Number one, export. China joined WTO in 2002. Then they produced, exported products to all over the world. That maintained about 10 years and stopped and will never continue because China has about 1/4 of labor in the world. If it all work but do not consume, work very hard and buy a little, they will occupy all over the market all over the world. And that's not a sustainable international trade or international order. Therefore, after 2009, Chinese export went down gradually. And in last month, Chinese export dropped by 25%. So it's not an export boom anymore and the boom will not come back. So without export boom, Chinese government found the third way, investment that we all know from economics textbook. So it created a kind of real estate construction boom about 10 years ago. With that construction boom, China developed the largest real estate bubble, much worse than the ones in Japan we can observe. Now the construction boom is over. The real estate bubble is going to blow. Then, without the two booms, Chinese economy has already fallen down. Mrs. He already mentioned a lot about unemployment, bankruptcy, and a lot of other things. So I'm not going to talk much more about that. I just want to point out one thing. From now on, when we are talking about China, it's no longer an economic superpower. It is a weak economy. And based upon that, we now talk about a little more about the leadership. In the history of the communist countries, there are only two leadership patterns. One, I call it the collective leadership. The other is individual leadership. Stalin and Mao is the typical example of individual leadership. And Deng Xiaoping and Khrushchev, they were kind of collective leadership model. So from the very beginning of the Communist Party's rule, it was collective leadership. And then it's like a pendulum, swings from collective leadership to individual leadership. Then started the Stalin and the Mao era, because the communist leadership needs absorb and utilize as much as possible resources for its industrialization and militarization. Therefore, criticism from population, from its party, even from among top leaders, could be observed, and then the top leader choose to establish his personal dictatorship. Then, after they dead, like Stalin and Mao dead, the pendulum swung back to collective leadership again. So we found in Deng Xiaoping era in China and in the Khrushchev to Gorbachev era in Russia, that both the former Soviet Union and China did not have very much political, personal dictators. However, one thing is important. For communist rule, the individual leadership is the low-cost leadership, and the collective leadership is a high-cost leadership. I don't have time to explain more about the two, why it's low, why it's high. But now, China is the only country in all the former, in the communist country history that it moves back from collective leadership to individual leadership of Xi Jinping. So in other words, Xi Jinping may become another dictator in the history of Chinese Communist Party because I think it is not his personal preference. It is not only a temporary short-run arrangement. It is a kind of institutionalized setting. Only under his personal individual authority, he could able to initiate anti-corruption campaign to stop capital flight, all for only one purpose, to cutting the ruling cost, to extend the rule of the Communist Party as long as possible. So at this time, you can see that the Chinese government now become very, very conservative than never before. And under such situation, with weak economy and a strong individual leadership, would China be more threatenful? My answer is no, because China just initiates a military reform to change its field military organization to a modern military administration and command system. With this reform, it will take, I think, more than 10 years to reorganize its army, air force, navy, and missile units, and also to train a new generation who can know all knowledge about those military units. That's a quite long process. And at the same time, China's economy is weak. Its military expenses will have to be reduced. In that way, China will have no effective army to conduct any effective, aggressive actions against its surrounding countries and the forces of the United States. So I think if we understand the latest political and economic development in China, we may try to think the behavior of the Chinese regime in the next decade with a different view.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. It makes me curious about sort of how the CCP plans to further integrate the middle class into the party, because I imagine that needs to be the next step in sort of consolidating power and keeping party legitimacy. I know we're running short on time, and I would have liked to give you guys a Q&A. Oh, we're okay. All right. So I think how I'll actually do the Q&A is maybe I'll take a grouped at a time, 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then we'll have our panelists respond in turn. So again, thank you so much, panelists, and thank you, audience members, for bearing with us. So if there are any questions, we'll take a couple at a time.
Thank you. I'm the founder of a relevant U.S. China-ish internet startup, and I'm just curious what the panelists' viewpoint is on the increasing influence of Washington and Silicon Valley internet companies in U.S. China relations. Thank you.
Thanks. And
hi, my name is Garrett van der Wees, editor of Taiwan Communique. I just had a question for the panel. We have been talking about China's rise all the time, but particularly the last speaker was talking about a number of fundamentals that are really eroding and that you are seeing more and more bubbles popping. Of course, the Chinese leadership wants to extend the China's rise, but shouldn't we as analysts perhaps talk about the rise and fall or decline of China?
and we'll take a third one. Sir?
Yeah, Bill Jones in EIR. Comments on just the Chinese economy, and everybody, of course, is talking about how it's the imminent collapse of the Chinese economy. But if you look at the last, the two sessions, everybody's aware of the fact that the export market is pretty much gone. So what China's doing is they're emphasizing infrastructure investment, and now they've got this new idea of production capacity sharing, that is taking chunks of Chinese industry, engineers, technology, and the like, and actually offering them to the other countries along this Belt and Road, which has become very important for them. It seems to me that, and you talk to students in Lanzhou, you ask them, what are you going to do in the future? Oh, I'm going to go to Africa and I'm going to, build bridges, or I'm going to build power plants. So there is an option there, and what they stressed at the two sessions was that the physical economy, or the real economy, has to be subordinate to the financial economy. Whereas in the United States, the real economy is subordinate to a financial economy, which is why this economy isn't working. And to some extent, if you're making judgments on China, it looks as if we're doing it from the deck of the Titanic in terms of the economic situation. And therefore, I think that China has a lot more capabilities now than people are saying when they're talking about the imminent collapse. And if you want to comment on these two issues, the infrastructure investment and the industrial production sharing, a new concept, maybe it's not so clear, it's not terribly clear to me either, but I get the gist of it.
Thank you, sir. So I think the first question was about the influence of China in Silicon Valley. So maybe Dr. Roberts, if you want to talk about that.
So I think this is a really interesting question, and I think that Silicon Valley is, I talked a little bit about the concerns that I have about this separation of Chinese and U.S. media, and I think that Silicon Valley is our strongest solution to that, and here's why. So I talked a little bit about how censorship has costs. And one of these big costs is that when you block internet companies and you block websites in China, that this is blocking some of the most innovative companies from Chinese citizens. And so I've talked a lot to people in Beijing who are working on startups, and they have a lot of concerns about being blocked from using Google's platforms, being blocked from using GitHub and Dropbox and all of these different tools that are quite useful to doing startups. And so I think that my hope is that the costs of blocking these companies will, because of the innovation going on in Silicon Valley, will become too high, and there'll have to be some loosening. I'm not sure if that will be the case, but I certainly think it would be better for the economy, for the growing startup economy in China, if there were fewer blocks on really useful internet tools that are coming out of Silicon Valley. The other sort of hope that I have is that U.S. companies will be will not make as many concessions, censorship concessions, if they do go into China. Because I think that they have to realize the value add that their services provide to the Chinese economy, and to really be quite adamant about keeping information free if they do enter China.
And then the second and third questions related to Chinese economy, the rise and fall of China, as well as the emphasis on infrastructure and production capacity. So maybe Dr. Chung or anyone?
First of all, about the infrastructure investment, it has already been overinvested in China. Therefore, Chinese government raised a new project called, the Belt and Road. But the fate of the Belt and Road project depends upon the economic situation in Europe, because that's the destination and the market of all those goods transport from China to the destination. Now, the situation in Europe is no good. After the refugee crisis, the European Union may not survive for many years. So after that, I think the Chinese government will not benefit from anything from its Belt and Road project. Because after they finish the construction projects, even it's funded by Chinese own money, they cannot transport goods to anywhere because at the time in European countries they may already have tariffs, and Chinese goods are no longer really poor or really cheap, and European people may not have enough purchasing power to buy those goods.
Dr. Master, do you have a comment?
Yes, I just wanted to add something to the discussion about the rise of China versus the weaknesses in China. I think the positions of the panelists here actually provide a very good sampling of what the discussion is in Washington. For the most part, for many years, people talked about how the Chinese Communist Party could not maintain power and the current system did not have the legitimacy to do so. And largely because of the legacy of the Cold War, at least in the military realm, most people were planning for and thinking about conflict with the China that was in a weak position. I think because we did not foresee the internal collapse of the Soviet Union, now we're patting ourselves on the back for foreseeing the internal collapse of China. But empirically, the situations are so different. And while as a strategist, I think we need to plan for all scenarios, my bets are on having to deal with a China that is not only confident, but also one that has the support of its people insofar as certain types of security and military operations it might have to engage in, versus a China that is engaging aggressively to placate an unhappy public, or a China that is acting aggressively because of internal economic situations. So I think we do talk a lot about a weak China, and maybe I overemphasize the rise because I'm hoping we talk and plan and think equally about a strong China in the future.
And Dr. Lee?
I'll quickly answer two questions. The first one about exporting Chinese excess capacity, particularly in infrastructure. Look, it seems like a great idea. China has all this capacity to build infrastructure. Why not send it overseas? But if you think about the places they have to go, Africa, Laos, Cambodia, Azerbaijan, try making money in these places. They don't have the institutional capacity within which money can be made. If they had, a lot of other people would be making money. If you look at Chinese foreign direct investment around the world, it is a massive loss-making enterprise because it's not enough just to throw money and capacity at countries and think you'll make money. I mean, you can find the figures yourself. It's actually a terrible balance sheet thing for the Chinese. So it's not such an easy matter to just export capacity. On the other question about, look, what about strategic planning with a failing China? Look, my concession in 2009, I wrote a book, Will China Fail, largely focusing on these economic problems. Now, as a matter of prudence, you don't plan that China will fail if you're a strategic planner. But you do know that China is hitting obstacles and there will be at best a gradual decline. So I think the conversation has changed from how do we plan for a situation where time is on China's side to how do we plan for a situation where China has a window of opportunity, but time may not be on China's side. So you look at all the variables that matter, demographics. China's going to be like Western Europe in 15 years. They're not prepared for it. You look at their current fiscal situation, it's getting worse. Currently, the central government, after transfers to local government, spends 20% on the PLA and about 20% on the People's Armed Police. So 40% of discretionary spending is on national security. I don't think China can do this in this stagnating environment. So what I'm really trying to say in a very top-down way is we can now begin to plan for a situation where holding ground may actually be a winning strategy, or at least a very effective strategy with the Chinese.
And with that, I'm going to conclude our very short but brief Q&A session because we do have another great panel coming up with Dr. Ashley Tellis and Dr. Kathleen Hicks and Randy Shriver. So if you please give our panelists a round of applause. And over just a few minutes, we'll start the next panel. Thank you very much. We'll sort of take like a 5-minute break and we'll come back.
Ladies and gentlemen, please head back to your seats. Our next panel discussion will be beginning soon. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, our next panel discussion will be beginning soon. Please head back to your seats. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please head back to your seats. Our next panel discussion is about to begin. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please head back to your seats. Our next panel discussion is about to begin. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, our panel is about to begin. Please take your seats. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Our panel discussion is about to begin. Thank you.
All right, thank you. If we could resume, come back to order. I'm really happy to be moderating this discussion, and this will be a little different format. We'll conduct this as a discussion between two experts and friends of mine. We've been talking through the assistance of Evan and his scene setter presentation and the panelists. We've been talking about the approach of responsible stakeholder and how that has sort of played out in different sectors, and so we want to continue that conversation. I'm joined up here, you have the bios, but just very briefly, Dr. Kath Hicks, who I had the pleasure and privilege of working with in the Department of Defense. We won't say when we started there, but a while ago, and enjoyed being a colleague of hers there. She went on to become Principal Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, and I didn't. So that tells you something about her career. She was quite successful at the Pentagon and quite an accomplished and I would say excellent public servant at the Department of Defense. Is now at CSIS as a Senior Vice President, runs the International Security Program. She got her doctorate at a small institute you might have heard of, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Master's degree from the University of Maryland, and her undergraduate from Mount Holyoke. Ashley Tellis, somebody I also served with in a different administration. We served together in the Bush administration. Ashley was a special assistant and senior advisor to some of the key principals in our department, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and played a very important and special role as an assistant to our U.S. ambassador in India at the time, and among other things was very key in securing the U.S.-India Nuclear Cooperation Agreement. He has served at RAND in the past. He is now serving at the Carnegie Endowment, and he got his PhD from also a little-known institution, the University of Chicago, master's and PhD at the University of Chicago, right? As you can tell, I am seated here with some large brains, great gray matter, and they'll help us continue to work through these issues. I might also add, although we're nonpartisan, non-political, and this is a nonpartisan discussion, I will tell you they've each worked on political campaigns, including in this cycle. One of them has been more successful than the other based on the candidate, but I won't mention who is who. We'll keep it nonpartisan. But just rest assured, we're well covered here across the political spectrum. So if I could just kick off. So we started talking through Evan's help about 2005, the responsible stakeholder approach, and kind of worked our way to the present. And it might be easy to say we're seeing a lot of assertive, aggressive behavior. We're seeing a lot of adventurism and direct challenges to our interests. It might be easy to conclude, well, this hasn't worked so well. But there's another narrative out there, which is China's being opportunistic. These are ad hoc approaches and activities. There are internal differences between the PLA and the civilian leadership. There's not necessarily an outcome of strategy. I know, Kath, you've been looking at South China Sea, among other things. Do you see this as China's activities as a product of strategy and a particular vision that they're aiming towards, or do you see it as more ad hoc and opportunistic?
Sure. The answer is more the former, but as to your comment on gray matter, these are gray areas. Let me explain what I mean by that. I think there's no doubt in my mind that the Chinese have a strategy, and I think we have come in some ways, in the United States in particular, to think of strategy in an extremely confining linear way that is not based in reality, and certainly the Chinese actions don't reflect what we come to think of as strategy, which is there's a goal and then you have these very specific planned activities that lead to that goal. I think it's a much more successful strategy than that, because I think it has as its goal changing the status quo, changing the nature of the expectation about what is Chinese sovereign territory and what is international or what is others' territory. And is there opportunism and even individual actions that aren't well coordinated going on? Absolutely. But those collectively do still generally drive toward that outcome. And that's what makes it tricky, I think, among many things for the U.S. is because on many individual instances, you might be able to explain it away by virtue of sort of the drunk sea captain, if you will, or the wayward pilot who's being too aggressive, whatever the answer is. But we really have to keep in our mind's eye that these collectively, whatever analogy people prefer to use, the salami slicing, cabbage peeling, whichever analogy works for you, there is a change going on incrementally on the status quo, and it's very strategic and it's pretty successful.
So Ashley, same type of question. I know you have thought a lot about China and the Asia Pacific and what they're up to. Is this a strategic vision that is being implemented? And if so, can we actually alter them from this vision? I mean, if it's a strategy and they might meet obstacles from time to time, but they know where they're headed, that's an entirely different challenge than something that is ad hoc or opportunistic, where they haven't a fully defined and informed strategy. So,
well, I certainly think the Chinese have a strategy and a vision. But I agree with Kath completely that it's not a strategy that translates into a simple manual that predetermines things to be done on a timetable. So if you think of a state as a very complex organism, right, there are certain binding principles, certain binding objectives that the state as an institution seeks to pursue. But in the implementation, there is plenty of room for ad hocism, for opportunism. And so I think of that as a complementarity. So what is the strategy and what are the sort of wild cards? I think the strategy is China's desire to cement its rise and become a great power. That is the strategic objective, to recover the greatness that it once had in the Asia-Pacific region. Beyond that, I think everything is negotiable depending on circumstances. So it's the pursuit of material capabilities that allows China to become a defining factor in the international system, which is the goal, and which I think is the abiding goal. How that translates is a matter of circumstance and opportunity. So the question you asked me, is there a way to deflect China from doing this rather than that? The answer is yes. Because like any rational state, the Chinese are sensitive to costs. They recognize cost benefits. And so if the United States and the international community can create circumstances where some behaviors are rewarded, other behaviors are contested, and still other behaviors are checkmated, it is possible to shape Chinese choices. And so I see the coexistence of a grand strategy and opportunism as being entirely compatible in that sense.
You know, something you said brought a question to mind. So they have a strategy, and it is really about status, being a great power, being treated as such, and all the trappings associated with that. Does that suggest there's more latitude on our part with treating them a certain way and using the symbology of great power status and you know, sort of accommodating their ego, if I could say that, rather than accommodating them on all these individual issue areas we're being challenged on, whether it's South China Sea or, in other words, you said it's largely about status. Is there leverage there? Is there room to play there by feeding that, as opposed to accommodation across other issues we care a great deal about?
Well, it is about status, but it's not solely about status. I think it's, you know, the Chinese are good Leninists in the old-fashioned sense of the word. They understand that power ultimately is material power, and that when you accumulate material power in quantities that are qualitatively different from that possessed by others, that conveys status. And so when you talk of the Chinese seeking the status of a great power, it's really a shorthand for saying they want to build the material capabilities that allow them to behave effectively as a great power in the international system. Which means for the United States and its partners, the leverages come at two levels. What is it that we can and cannot do with respect to China's accumulation and exercise of power? That's the material question. And then there is the status question, that is, can we deny the Chinese certain claims which may exist at a more abstract level and are sort of less connected to material elements? And I think for successful policy, you really have to operate at both levels.
Kath, on the defense side, I know you look at particular areas where China has been challenging our interests and probing. Do we have a good sense of even the toolbox? Do we understand where our leverage is? Do we understand in a clear way which activities we can accept, if not optimal, not like, but we can accept, ones that we definitely want to confront them on, if not alter their course? And if we have that question answered correctly, or at least answered, do we understand the toolbox and the leverage and the things that we can bring to bear to address that?
I think fundamentally, yes, on the first, we understand. I think there is a U.S. perspective that is largely bipartisan, speaking on behalf of the establishment, which may not speak for a variety of other people, of what that set of red lines, for lack of a better term, where the U.S. believes that there are clear areas of interest for the U.S. And where the Chinese actions are coming over those lines. That said, I think the toolbox is where there's a lot less clarity. I think it's partially because we're just not as savvy as we should be at the national level, and then there is the complicating, though generally speaking helpful aspect of working in alliance or coalition. The third-party elements obviously are almost always the first point of friction. So that creates much more complication on the U.S. side. Now, that complication is a huge advantage in the long term, and I think the Chinese have definitely overplayed their hand. That said, that doesn't mean that you can just wait for that to play itself out and that that they're not gaining advantage in a tactical sense that has strategic outcome. I do think they're having advantages in tactical senses that have strategic outcome. So that's where the toolbox comes in. I think on the military to military, the U.S. is pretty good. I think on the strategic messaging, we are not. We stumble over ourselves. Certainly this whole issue of neutrality with regard to claims versus where we sort of lean in and out at different times in different situations with the language of different parts of the government. That's complicated for us. And I think we have to hone the strategic messaging and make sure that we have a strong, obviously coordinated, worked with allies, but a strong U.S. perspective that comes forward. I think we're also really challenged by these, what my colleague Mike Greenlight has started to call the little blue men, meaning they're in the water, as opposed to with Russia, we call them little green men. So we're really challenged by the use of the Coast Guard, fishing vessels, things of that sort that are, quasi-military in nature, and we don't come to the game, if you will, with that same. We come with gray holes, with U.S. Navy approaches, and same in the air. So that, I think, has challenged us about how do we treat those, because we obviously are trying to figure out and maybe fixate a little on how those operate within the Chinese system, and we get ourselves wound around this issue, I think, that you started with, of, is this the PLA? Is this the PLAN? Is it coming from Xi Jinping? Is it a wayward vessel? And I think we spin ourselves up so much on that we really haven't figured out how to manage that piece of it, which is something that we're looking at CSIS. And then there's this, the diplomatic pieces, the international law elements, the law of the sea, which the U.S. has not been a leader in, to say the least. There are some other elements that fit into both diplomacy and strategic messaging. And then lastly, thinking about it as a grand game in terms of not just the particulars of that instance, but how we play it more broadly. Again, I would come back. I actually think on that, sometimes we've done pretty well. We've taken advantage, quite frankly, in terms of, for instance, areas that I've been involved in, posturing and presence of forces, where there's, sometimes the Chinese stumble so badly that they get others to be more interested in working with the U.S. The Philippines, Vietnam, places that really were not looking 5 years ago like they were terribly interested in having U.S. forces, are now much more interested in that, and we should be looking at that from a self-interested viewpoint in addition to the alliance viewpoint, what that provides for us. So I think that we've done a little better with, but overall, the integration of that toolkit in a national security level and then some of the individual pieces, I think we're quite behind.
Let me ask you a little bit more about that, because you've worked in government and bureaucracies, and Evan in his opening remarks was pointing out just how ill-equipped we are in terms of our organizational structure. We can't even decide what Asia is when we look at how our bureaucracies deal with it. PACOM does it differently,
Yes.
OSD does it differently,
Yeah.
State does it differently, NSC does it differently. Does that have to be addressed in a direct way before we can do the integration of this toolkit? I remember when I was at State Department, I had this brilliant idea, and you only get, well, at least for somebody like me, you only get one good idea probably in a couple of years, and I said, China's emergence really demands a more integrated approach even throughout this department, and I said we should have every bureau in the State Department should be able to identify at least one person who's doing China in their functional area. And of course I was accused of being very arrogant, that my issues were more important than their issues, and I don't think we got there at that point, but my sense is more and more, because we're just being pulled into so many bilaterals and so many activities with China, more and more everyone has probably a point person or somebody, a belly button you can say, that person spends a little bit of time thinking about China. I mean, do we have to get this organizational thing right before we can get the toolkit and the strategy right?
We do. I think I have a bias that is general and beyond this issue, but I will display in this issue. I think many of the problems can be solved with process over structure. Seams are almost always inevitable. In this case, we're talking about regional seam issues. That was the start of it. PACOM cuts the region differently than the State Department, then NSC, et cetera. You could try to line all the seams up, but at the end of the day, that's a pretty thick seam you're creating. So the question, there are ways to organizationally do better or worse, but really what you have to have no matter what are the processes, which you're pointing out sort of in the point about the people. What is the culture of thinking about big problems, wicked problems, frankly, in many cases, across different departments and agencies, let alone within agencies, it's hard, or departments, it's hard enough, but across them. One of the things that we at CSIS recently, maybe January, put out our assessment of the rebalance, which was a congressionally mandated report. And one of the things we point to is, look, there is no written strategy. And for all my qualms with how we think about strategy, there is a value to that. There is a value to having and evolving and keeping up with what is the U.S. government's view of how we think about China. You can cut this, we can use different lenses, but let's use China for the moment. What is our strategy with regard to China? What are our goals? If we see China as a responsible stakeholder, having that potential, how do we get there? And what are the toolbox elements of how you get there? That just simply is done much too ad hoc today for many of these big issue areas, China being foremost probably among them. You see the same conversation happening now with regard to Russia, which is absolutely true. Similar sort of, flail-ex, if anyone's familiar with that term, which is everyone runs around and, lots of cylinders of excellence working independently, people working long hours, but you're not seeing a lot of value out of that. That integration has to come centrally out of the NSC. It has to. And so you've seen inevitably at the end of every administration, there is a call for NSC reform. You see it again today. I think the next administration, if there's anything different about what's come before, it is the pace and of change and the need to be extremely agile with diminishing resources across this broad range of, a very turbulent world. I don't have a quick answer for how you do that, but I can tell you for sure we don't have it mastered today.
And Ashley, turning back to possible approaches to China and understanding leverage and so forth, if we're confronted with a Chinese strategy that is revisionist and challenging us on a number of fronts, what kind of cooperation is still possible within that framework? And is it possible that through cooperation in areas where we have shared interests, and as Evan pointed out, shared interest is a starting point, not an end point. You need to have a program and an implementation strategy. How much can that possibly, to use the phrases that people use, build trust, build habits of cooperation, so that you can alter sort of that nature of the strategic confrontation? I spoke at APAC this weekend. I like to think I warmed the crowd up for Donald Trump. And we talked about China in the Middle East, which was a very interesting conversation. And somebody put forward, if you want to find an area where we have overlapping interests with China, it's the Middle East, because energy, we both need safe, secure, reliable supplies of energy, and the growing terrorism threat. I've heard that on social media usage by ISIS, almost 20% of it is in the Uyghur language. That would certainly get the Chinese attention, but it would also certainly suggest we have a shared interest here, and that the model should be develop these habits of cooperation where we have shared interests in the Middle East, and then we can somehow bring that back into the more contentious areas that we're faced in the Asia Pacific. Is this kind of thinking, is this make you more optimistic, or do you think it's flawed?
Can I just hold off for a second on the answer to this one, only because I want to add something to what Kat said earlier. Within the strategic challenge of managing China, there are plenty of complications inside the black box, right? She described that, I think, wonderfully. But I think it pays at some point to sort of increase the aperture and ask the fundamental question of where does China fit into larger US grand strategic interests? Because sometimes we are so overwhelmed by the complexity of getting policy right with respect to country X or country Y, that we forget how country Y ought to fit in a larger menu of choices. Now, I think this administration has actually done a very good job in terms of its strategic prioritization of how different regions fit into our interests. But even this administration, with the best of intentions, has been unable to avoid the old trap, where the really important questions are always subordinated to the most urgent. Right? If you look at the amount of leadership time and leadership resources that are spent on problems in the world today, the Middle East is probably number one, followed by the challenges of managing Russia in the Eurasian space, and the challenges of China probably come number three. And I would argue that that is completely inverse to the relative importance of these three regions. This does not mean that one does not pay attention to Russia, does not pay attention to the Middle East. But in the grand scheme of things, China's rise, China's economic importance as the motor of growth in Asia, the connectivity with Asia, these are far more important for US national interests over the long term. So getting the balance right between China and other challenges is the first order problem that we have not mastered. And if we were to find some way of mastering that, that would be a huge advance, right? Now, on the second order question which you asked, which is, what is the strategy that we ought to have? I think the first point we need to sort of recognize is that we no longer have the luxury of unidimensional strategies with respect to China. Because unlike the Soviet Union, which was a pure zero-sum competition, the relationship with China is a mix-sum game. And so we're going to have to do a much better job of balancing those areas where there are common interests and where there are positive gains to be made through cooperation, while at the same time being acutely conscious of the fact that those positive sum games sort of end at some seam, and competition takes over. And we have to be able to sort of walk and chew gum at the same time. Right? And so when we talk about finding strategies that allow us to compete effectively, this doesn't mean that we do it at the cost of foregoing cooperation where cooperation is possible. It's simply that you cannot be so starry-eyed as to think that simply because we have areas of cooperation, somehow the areas of competition either dissolve or take care of themselves. They don't. And so we've got to be smart enough to figure out which areas we can cooperate in and which areas we can compete in. And I think our policies will always have an internal tension within them. And we will never have the satisfaction as we did in the Cold War years of saying, with the exception of avoiding nuclear war, which was the only common interest we had, we could compete with the Soviets all the way until that point. With China, it's going to be a lot more difficult, which means, the variables that Kath identified, being nimble, right? Being creative. There's going to be a terrific premium on these issues. And in a democracy, I think it's even harder, because in a democracy, simple strategies have an advantage. If you can identify a threat and say, this is the enemy, it's easy to do social mobilization in support of policies that confront the enemy. But if you say, well, this country is an adversary, but it's not entirely an adversary, we also have, cooperative relations. Getting social and political support behind complex strategies that have a mix of competition and cooperation is extremely difficult. And so this will always be, from my vantage point, a work in progress. We will do better in some cases, we will do worse in some cases, but we will never have the satisfaction of saying, this is a clean strategy. All we have to do is do better at it. What is better is going to be contested at every step of the way.
There's another theory. So you basically have said it would be flawed thinking to say you develop habits of cooperation and that will either eliminate or mitigate areas where you have competition. There's another school that says look at where you're competing and make some strategic choices about accommodation and deal with that side of the ledger. There's an abandoned Taiwan school, I would say not huge, not very popular, particularly not in the Congress, but prominent people involved. There are people who say internal issues, Tibet, Xinjiang, they've identified it as a core interest. We should take that off the table and deal with the behavior that most directly confronts us in the region and globally. So it's sort of the reverse of the previous question, taking some of the elements of competition and trying to remove them.
I don't think you can do that as easily. as people think. Even if there are purely internal issues in China, they do implicate American interests, because the way China chooses to deal with those issues has an impact on what we think being responsible means. Right? If the Chinese decide to say Tibet is an internal problem, therefore we can massacre as many Tibetans as we want, and it's none of your business, sorry, but that's not going to work. Right? So I think, first, the strategy of saying we can make accommodations at the cost of others, to my mind, I think is a recipe for real trouble. If you want accommodations, they have to be accommodations that are mutually negotiated with all the stakeholders. If the Chinese are willing to live with that kind of accommodation, I'm all for it. But if there is an accommodation that requires us to sacrifice countries that look up to the United States for protection and for support, I'm not willing to go there. Because to my mind, that only opens the door for even bigger and even worse compromises that would be disadvantageous to the United States. And I simply don't want to take the risks of walking down this road, because I don't know where it'll lead.
I am aware that our previous two sessions ran right up against the deadline. I, in fact, went over, and we didn't get a lot of Q&A. I'd be happy to open this discussion to the audience at this point if there are questions. So why don't we, I saw one hand, start two hands, okay. I'm obviously making, I'm not asking the right questions, obviously. So why don't we open it up for the last 10 minutes or so.
Hi, McDaniel Wicker from the Wilson Center. I have a question. You mentioned that relations with China don't have to be a zero-sum game like they were with the USSR. And that's a pretty widely held opinion here in the U.S. But how do we know that's how the Chinese see it? Are we sure that's what Xi Jinping thinks when he wakes up in the morning? Maybe he does see it as a zero-sum game.
Well, I'll respond as a non-China specialist. I am drawn to the, you all can tell me if this is wildly unpopular, but I'm sort of drawn to the go versus chess analogy. I think it has meaning to me, at least as a defense analyst when I think strategically, that maybe there is not this sort of tradition of everything is zero-sum. And to go back to, I very much agree with Ashley, which maybe makes an uninteresting conversation, but I will just add that I think that, you know, one of the things that we can do, hopefully, is demonstrate to China where it gets value out of the international liberal world order. Now, again, sorry to jump into our politics, we seem to be having trouble in the United States right now with deciding if we want to maintain and do what it takes to lead an international order as designed by the United States. But even if we can't convince our own public, perhaps we can convince the Chinese that there are some advantages to them, and not just free rider advantages, that's not what I mean, but advantages to having rule of law, being able to tackle issues like climate change that they are increasingly feeling, pick those topics. So I think there is, my gut, which is only a gut, is that it is not, you can get to a viewpoint inside China that it is not zero-sum. And in fact, there are a lot of areas of potential cooperation where functionally we can prove that point. I think in the military sphere, there are definitely cases where you have no choice but to see that it's a zero-sum. And that is where the competition is important, to always keep in your mind that there are facts on the ground, if you will, facts in the water. And regardless of how we view each other's intentions, we need to follow those facts. And they guide us into some areas that make us very worried and where we need to invest to make sure that we have the capabilities that it takes to protect U.S. interests, to include our allies. And if I can just add one thing on Randy's point, jumping in, on sort of the give up Taiwan, et cetera. This is a point of incredible frustration for me from my time inside government, that you would occasionally come across folks who, it is not that they have that opinion, it is that they often seem to come to that opinion not based on interests. It's not based on have we reassessed our interests and our interests are now different. It is solely based on, well, this is hard and expensive. Let's kind of give up that enterprise. And that, as a strategist, you can get yourself there by a cost-benefit analysis, but But I find more often than not, it's sort of a, well, that got harder. Why don't we just kind of stop trying for that now? So frustrating.
I want to say hallelujah to everything. Because I'm really tired of people who come up and say, this is a difficult strategic problem.
Right.
We have to run away from it
Yes.
and find an easier one. Right?
Yep.
I mean, this is a recipe for,
Yeah.
if not decline, precipitous decline. I mean, great powers who act this way, one, don't deserve to be great powers. Two, will never be able to preserve the system to serve their interests. I would just add one thing to what Kathy said. We should do our best to understand where the Chinese, or for that matter, every other country we relate to comes from. You know, having that understanding makes for, I believe, smarter policy. But at the end of the day, you are never going to be comfortable that you know fully what their motivations are. So what do you have left? What I think you have left are simply your interests. And if you understand what your interests are and the price you are willing to pay to defend those interests, which is another way of saying you have to do your own rank ordering of interests, right? I think we'll be okay. We'll be okay. So we have to do a better job of, sort of convincing ourselves as a body politic why we are doing the things we do. And once there is a national consensus behind core goals that we have to protect, all we have to do is go out and protect those goals. And whether that happens to be part of Xi's worldview or not, I mean, the interactions themselves will decide the outcomes.
Diamond Liu, perhaps my question is heresy to IR, but I wonder when you devise your grand schemes, how much do you take into account the structure of power in China and the reality of power in China, or the failure of governing in China? And also, when you talk about interest, I wonder if there's such thing as permanent interest. Interest, it appears to me, is dictated by whoever that's in power.
This is a complicated question on which one could actually have a graduate seminar that lasts for months, right? But I'm going to make just 2 points. One, if the United States is insensitive to issues relating to the structure and exercise of power within China, it will adopt policies that will ultimately fail. Because we need to appreciate what is it that makes the Chinese leadership tick? What are the things they value most? Very clearly, that has to be part of an understanding of our interests and the limits to which we can pursue certain policies. So that's point number one. Point number two, I have an old-fashioned realist way of thinking about this. While I would like the Chinese state to be more and more like my own, I'm willing to live with the Chinese state as it is, so long as its actions do not undermine my core interests. And so if the Chinese state, whatever its internal preferences are, is willing to do things that do not undermine what I see as American national interests, these are things that I can live with. Now, the larger point you make, which I cannot answer here, certainly not in a couple of minutes, is do I have permanent interests? Are these interests sort of negotiable? Do they change over time? All those are more complicated. But I think for the moment, one can say with some confidence that we do have some core interests that we want to preserve today. For example, we want to create a political order in the Indo-Pacific region, which allows essentially for the freedom of all countries to pursue economic growth in accordance with their means. We want to create a regime in the Indo-Pacific where the commons are protected against undue interference. We want to create a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific where one nation does not become so powerful that essentially it denudes the security and the autonomy of all other states. I think these are three principles that I believe constitute American interests today. Will these be the same interests in 2050? I don't know. But for the moment, if I have a national obligation to protect my country's interests, I think these are the three principles that at a minimum, I think the United States ought to protect, because not protecting these would have very severe consequences for our position in the world.
I just want to add, there really have been four truly enduring interests the United States has held since the end of World War II at least. And I agree, who knows if they'll be here 9 months from now, let alone 10 years from now. But they are basically the same. They are protect the U.S. territory, its citizens, and its allies. And so you can see already, citizens, territory, and allies are all involved in the Pacific. It is, second, the international economic order that promotes U.S. economic interests. That's self-interested U.S., which includes the liberal international order that we helped to create. The third is rule of law. And it's consistent, again, across administrations from the left or right. And the fourth, which is the one that the interpretation of which often can get us into trouble, is human rights. And the United States has always had an element of a human rights agenda, again, interpreted differently in how it's actioned from one administration to the next. But those are really the four fundamental interests of the United States in its foreign policy. Again, subject to change, but they've been pretty enduring.
I would suggest the People's Republic of China, it's easier to identify, if not permanent, at least enduring long-term interests, and that's the survival, health, and well-being of the Communist Party of China. And one of the interesting things is, since Diamond, this question was generated by you, I see you sitting with Bob Sudinger, we used to talk about a policy of peaceful evolution, and it was pretty clear what we were talking about. That part of our approach was to try to encourage and engender change inside China, evolution from CCP, authoritarian rule, to something more liberal, something more closely resembling democracy. And Ashley, you said you don't care what's inside as long as they're not affecting your interests. But I guess I'm going to push you on this a little bit. If the enduring interest is the survival, health, and well-being of the CCP, and that manifests in certain behaviors externally, I mean, can you have this sort of division of not caring about inside the box and only dealing with outside the box?
No, it's going to be a very fuzzy line. And now, the moment you come to this question, you really come to the area of prudential judgment, right? Because you can say, we don't want to push the Chinese beyond a certain point because it would be bad for those whose interests inside China we wish to protect, as well as our own. But these are judgment calls that depend on situation to situation. So you can have the principle that the ideal is that you have a governing regime in China that is respectful of the rights of its citizens. But if that principle comes into collision with other important American interests that I'm not prepared to sacrifice, then however cold-hearted it may seem, I'm prepared to sacrifice the rights of Chinese citizens with respect to their own government in comparison to my interests. So these are difficult calls that, on the margins, will elicit different responses depending on circumstances, depending on who's in office, and so on and so forth. And we've never had in our own history, and I think this is what Kath was getting to when you talk about human rights, right? The reason why it has been an oscillating priority is because there are very difficult choices that attend the application of that principle. And we can never say, no matter how committed we are as human beings to human rights, that it must be the cardinal sort of corner of our policy to the neglect of everything else. We can never, I think that would be irresponsible, right? So
let me just add on that. I mean, going a little beyond just China, I mean, the U.S. is sort of doomed in a way to selective engagement. It just is. Because of the domestic public element in particular, there will be the times and places when we choose to use force or military forces will never be crystal clear. And this is something I always try to tell my Chinese counterparts, like, don't be surprised when the U.S. flips on you when you least expect it. We cannot want to go into Syria and then want to go save the girls in Nigeria, and it all can happen in the same week. And that's part of our je ne sais quoi as a nation, and that is something not to be taken lightly. Just like we need to understand, to the question that really originated this, how the Chinese leadership is trying to manage a domestic audience and situation, and how their external activities relate very clearly to that problem set. And if we don't look inside that, proverbial black box, it's to our detriment because we're not understanding then what drives the facts on the ground that we want to change.
Might be able to collect two quick ones. Garrett, and in the back. Let's collect two, and then we'll close out. So.
Garrett Van der Wees of Taiwan Communique. Kathy, you mentioned that in strategic messaging, the U.S. had actually not been that good. And a couple of examples that come to my mind is that in many of the crucial issues like South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan, the U.S. always starts its statement by, we do not take a position on the sovereignty. Wouldn't it increase our leverage if we would, in a sense, take a position on the end result? Wouldn't that help us in getting our message across?
Well, I'll go back to what I just said about the enduring interests. I mean, rule of law really is an interest for the United States, and there are many truly contested international issues at stake here. I think the way in which, for instance, the Philippines have brought Scarborough Shoal forward into the international legal structure, that is a continuation of a U.S. view that there are, legitimate territorial issues at play here. What we object to, I think the right approach for the U.S. is what we object to is the action taken by parties to include China, and China being the most aggressive in the last several years, of course, with land reclamation and building out military capability to sort of create a fait accompli with regard to those territorial disputes. So I'm comfortable, frankly, with starting where we start. What I was pointing to is we then kind of wander often with different elements within an administration. I don't think that's unique to this administration, but I think it, as the information age progresses, it gets harder and harder inside an administration to stick to a clean strategic communication set of points, and that really challenges us.
So yes.
Yeah, Ken Meyercourt, World Docs. Speaking of territorial disputes, our position is that we don't take a stand on the question of sovereignty over these areas, but by entering the territorial waters of areas claimed by China, aren't we denying the possibility that they fall under the sovereignty of China? Because if they did, we shouldn't be entering those waters without their permission. Wouldn't it be better with regard to the territorial waters of disputed areas not to enter them, since by our own admission, we don't know who we should be asking for permission to enter those waters?
Wow, I mean, that is a logic flow I cannot accept. Lots of things to think here. First of all, to the extent that the territories or lands or whatever we're talking about here, the features, do not have at high tide visible land formation, then no. And that's what we're talking about in many of these cases, except where the Chinese are now rapidly building those up so that they do. So I don't want to get into a lengthy discussion of international law. For one thing, I will probably get it not quite right. But so right there, that's a whole slew of them that are off the table as being legitimately a territorial feature that you cannot go within 12 nautical miles of. So that's the first thing. And that's what we're talking about in many of these cases with regard to the Chinese. The next thing is we're not always just talking about that. We're often talking with the Chinese about EEZ, right? We're not talking just about the territorial waters. And EEZ, we go through EEZs all the time. They go through our EEZ. They just did it within the last year, and it was fine. We didn't do anything negative about it. So we exercise that same freedom. We respect that same freedom of navigation that we ourselves exercise, and it doesn't have to do with a claim of sovereignty to a territory. It has to do with their interpretation of EEZ. So I'll stop there.
Want to get in on this?
I just want to make one point. I agree with Kath on the basic principle, which is our position has always been that these features as they exist in nature do not incur the rights that normally incur to territories, real territories controlled by a state. And so by definition, these cannot be territorial waters simply because you happen to pile, a few kilograms of sand out there. And so our ability to operate in those waters is a repudiation of the claim that simply because we've piled a few kilograms of sand, we've created new rights. Where I think we are now being led is to a position where we would actually have to actively reject a claim of sovereignty. I mean, so far we've essentially been neutral by saying that we don't quite know who owns the feature, and we really don't care as long as you don't impede navigation. But I think because there is an effort now to create facts on the ground, the US will be compelled very soon to take a negative position with respect to the sovereignty claims that China and others, I mean Vietnam, Philippines, et cetera, are asserting. So I think this is the natural evolution of the effort to sort of change the facts on the ground.
I'm afraid we're going to have to end it there. I think you'll agree with me, there are strategic thinkers. There is strategic thinking in the United States. Despite some appearances, I think we've seen it here on this stage. And with that, we'll draw today's public event to a close. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Kath. And thank you, everybody.